The military dog yard went absolutely silent the moment she crossed the warning line. 18 war dogs, animals that had broken handlers, torn through reinforced leashes, and survived combat rotations that would shatter most human soldiers, turned their heads toward the woman in plain scrubs walking calmly into the center of their training yard. Not one of them attacked. Not one of them lunged. They simply watched her, the way dangerous things watch something they cannot categorize. Staff Sergeant Colton Voss stood at the fence with his arms crossed and laughed loud enough for his entire team to hear. He had no idea that the quiet nurse he had just mocked had spent 3 years on active battlefields doing things his training program had never come close to replicating. He was about to find out. If this story already has you hooked, do me a favor. Hit subscribe and follow along until the very end. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning Elena Marlowe drove through the gates of Raven Ridge Military Animal Command, she was running 7 minutes late and her coffee had gone cold somewhere on the interstate. She was not supposed to be there at all, technically. The assignment had come through the Regional Medical Contractor Network as a routine K-9 health evaluation, blood panels, behavioral screenings, documentation of injury patterns consistent with overwork or chronic stress. Standard stuff. The kind of assignment that usually went to someone more junior, someone who needed the field hours. But the contractor had a shortage that week, and Elena had the clearance level and the certification, so the dispatch coordinator had called her at 6:15 in the morning and asked if she could cover it. She had said yes before the coordinator finished the sentence, not because she needed the work. She had 3 other active contracts running simultaneously across Harwick County's civilian hospital network, and her schedule was the kind of thing that made other nurses shake their heads with a combination of respect and genuine concern for her health. She said yes because of the unit designation in the briefing file. Raven Ridge Military Animal Command, K-9 Division, Section 4. She had read that and set her coffee down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment doing nothing. Then she had grabbed her bag and driven. The base was 40 minutes east of Kellerton, the mid-sized city where Elena kept a rented apartment that she slept in approximately 4 nights a week when things were slow. The drive took her through flat farmland that turned into scrub brush and then into the kind of fenced, camera-monitored perimeter that told civilians they had reached the edge of somewhere they were not meant to enter without paperwork. Elena had the paperwork. She had the laminated contractor badge, the signed authorization from the base medical office, and a sealed case of evaluation equipment in the back of her car. What she did not have was any expectation that this would go smoothly. The first indication came from the gate guard, who looked at her badge, looked at her car, a 7-year-old sedan with a cracked side mirror, and looked back at her badge again with the particular expression of someone trying to decide whether to believe what they were reading. Medical contractor, she said, saving him the trouble. K-9 health evaluation. I'm on the schedule. He confirmed it, eventually, after a phone call that took 4 minutes longer than it should have. He waved her through without apologizing for the wait. She did not expect him to. She parked in the designated contractor lot, which was as far from the K-9 facility as it was physically possible to park while still technically being on the correct side of the fence, and walked. The morning air was sharp, carrying the smell of cut grass and something heavier underneath it. The particular animal musk that came from a working dog facility operating at full capacity. Elena recognized it immediately. Something in her chest did a quiet thing she did not examine too closely, and she kept walking. The K-9 facility was a cluster of low concrete buildings arranged around a central training yard roughly the size of a high school football field. Chain-link fencing, reinforced at the top, enclosed the perimeter. Inside the yard, she could see several handlers working with dogs on long leads, running through obedience patterns with the focused intensity of people who understood that imprecision in their work had real consequences. She found the operations office, knocked twice, and pushed the door open when no one answered. Staff Sergeant Colton Voss was seated behind a desk covered in binders and empty energy drink cans, talking on the phone with his feet up on the corner of the desk. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s, with close-cropped hair going gray at the temples and the kind of permanent sunburn that came from years of outdoor work. He looked at Elena when she entered, looked at his watch, and held up one finger without interrupting his phone call. She waited. He finished his call 3 minutes later, dropped the phone on the desk, and looked at her properly for the first time. His expression did not change into anything welcoming. "You're the medical contractor," he said. "Elena Marlowe. I'm here for the K9 health evaluation. Your base medical office scheduled it for this morning." I know what was scheduled. He swung his feet off the desk and sat forward, pulling a clipboard from under a binder and scanning it without apparent urgency. "I just didn't expect them to send someone from the civilian network. We usually get military medical." "Your military medical liaison is on leave. The contractor network was the backup arrangement." He looked at her over the top of the clipboard. "You done K9 evaluation before?" "Yes." "Military dogs specifically?" "Yes." He set the clipboard down. "Because these aren't therapy animals and they aren't pets. Half of these dogs have more combat hours than most of the handlers on this base, and they don't respond well to people who treat them like they need to be cuddled. I've had civilian contractors come through here before who thought they understood military working dogs because they watched a documentary. I'm telling you this up front so we don't waste each other's time." Elena held eye contact. "I understand." Voss studied her for another moment, then pushed back from the desk. "Fine. I'll have Specialist Krebs take you through the facility. You do the evaluations, you document what you find, and you don't interfere with active training exercises. Anything you think is a medical concern, you bring it to me before you put it in your report. Clear?" It was not really a question. "Clear," she said anyway. Specialist Dana Krebs was 24 years old, earnest to the point of being slightly exhausting, and visibly uncomfortable with the assignment of escorting a civilian contractor through a facility where she herself was still learning the protocols. She met Elena at the operations office door with a tablet and a too bright smile, and immediately launched into a rapid-fire briefing that covered facility layout, handler assignments, exercise schedules, and 3 separate warnings about not approaching kennels without authorized personnel present, all delivered at a pace that suggested she was working from a memorized script. She was afraid to slow down. Elena let her talk. She was busy looking at everything else. The facility was well maintained on the surface. Clean concrete, organized equipment storage, handlers who moved with confidence and knew their dogs by name. But Elena was not looking at the surface. She was watching the way the dogs held their bodies during the approach exercises happening in the nearest section of the training yard. The slight tension across the shoulders that most people would miss. The ears that stayed half back even during successful command sequences. The way certain animals' eyes tracked their handlers with something closer to wariness than partnership. She was looking at the dog in the far kennel run. He was isolated from the main group, a Belgian Malinois of exceptional physical condition. Lean, powerful, with the dense musculature that came from years of genuine working development rather than simple training exercises. His coloring was classic sable, darker across the muzzle and back, and he was currently sitting in the back corner of his enclosure watching the yard activity with an expression Elena could only describe as exhausted hostility. A placard on his kennel door read, "Titan, MWD 477, restricted access." "What's his status?" Elena asked, interrupting Krebs mid-sentence about documentation protocols. Krebs followed her gaze and the brightness in her expression dimmed slightly. "Titan, he's on a behavior review. He's been isolated since last month." "What happened last month?" "He refused 3 consecutive command sequences during a joint exercise and bit a handler. Not badly, it didn't break skin. But it was enough to pull him from active rotation." Krebs hesitated. "Staff Sergeant Voss has him flagged for potential decommission." Elena looked at Titan for another moment. The dog had noticed her watching him. He was looking back at her now, still and unreadable, with none of the escalating agitation that a truly unstable dog would show at the presence of an unfamiliar person entering his sightline. "I'll need to include him in the evaluation," she said. Krebs's brightness returned, this time with a layer of genuine anxiety underneath it. "I'd have to clear that with Staff Sergeant Voss. Titan's enclosure is restricted access. He's part of the unit. If I'm doing a unit-wide health evaluation, excluding one animal because he's having behavioral problems is exactly the kind of incomplete assessment that causes long-term issues." "I understand that, but check with Voss," Elena said, not unkindly. "I'll start with the general population while you sort it out." The evaluation work itself took most of the morning. Elena moved through the kennel blocks methodically, running through the full assessment protocol: physical examination, stimulus response testing, stress indicator documentation, handler interaction observation. She was thorough and quiet, and did not require much from the handlers beyond their cooperation in holding the animals during examination, which most of them provided without complaint once they understood she was not going to do anything alarming. She found what she expected to find, which was a unit under consistent high-performance pressure with insufficient recovery time built into the rotation schedule. The stress indicators were not at crisis level, but they were elevated across the board in ways that would compound over time if nothing changed. She documented everything carefully in the neutral clinical language of medical assessment and moved on. Around 11 o'clock, she was working with a 4-year-old Dutch shepherd named Rika when she heard Voss's voice carrying from somewhere behind her. "Absolutely not." She turned. Voss was crossing the yard toward her with Krebs following several steps behind, looking like she wished she could be somewhere else entirely. "The Titan evaluation," Elena said, "is not happening." Voss stopped a few feet away, arms folding across his chest in the same position she had seen him in through the fence when she arrived. "Titan is on a restricted behavior protocol. He's not accessible to contractor personnel. He's a working dog exhibiting behavioral changes significant enough to trigger a decommission review. That falls within the scope of a medical evaluation. It falls within the scope of my operational authority, which supersedes your contractor scope." He said it flatly, without particular heat, the way someone states a fact they believe requires no argument. "You do the standard population assessment, you write your report, and you're finished here by 1400 hours. Elena held the leash of the Dutch shepherd, who was sitting calmly at her left knee watching the exchange with her ears up and her head tilted at a slight angle. "The behavioral pattern I'm seeing in Titan is consistent with acute stress response following traumatic overstimulation. It's not an aggression problem. It's an injury that isn't being treated." "I didn't ask for your interpretation." "No, but it's going to be in my report regardless." Something shifted behind Voss's eyes. Not quite anger, not quite surprise, but a tightening of focus that told her she had moved from the category of manageable inconvenience into something that required a different response. "Listen," he said, dropping his voice slightly. "I've been running canine operations here for 6 years. I know these dogs better than any evaluation form does. Titan had a behavioral breakdown. It happens. The protocol for a dog that bites a handler and refuses command sequences is restriction and review. That's not a medical decision, that's an operational one." "What was the trigger event?" Elena asked. "For the breakdown." A pause. "Classified." "I have clearance." "You have contractor clearance, which is 3 levels below what would be required for that information." He uncrossed his arms. "We're done with this conversation. Krebs, please make sure our contractor has everything she needs for the general population documentation." He walked away. Krebs watched him go with an expression of visible relief that he was no longer in her immediate vicinity. Elena returned to her work, but she spent her lunch break, eaten alone at a picnic table outside the operations building with a sandwich from her car and a folded notebook she had brought with her, going through what she had observed about Titan from a distance. She wrote nothing actionable, nothing that could be read as exceeding her authorized scope. She simply wrote down what she had seen: the posture, the eye contact, the absence of the specific behavioral escalation markers that characterize genuinely dangerous animals as opposed to traumatized ones. She had seen this before. Not once, not twice. She had seen it enough times in enough places that she recognized it the way a mechanic recognizes an engine knocking wrong. Not from a chart, but from accumulated experience stored somewhere below the level of conscious thought. She was still sitting at the picnic table when the afternoon shift change brought a new rotation of handlers into the yard, and Voss assembled his senior team near the equipment storage building for what appeared to be a briefing about the afternoon's demonstration exercise. She could not hear what was said, but she saw Voss gesture toward the main yard area with the confidence of someone who had run this particular exercise many times before and expected no complications. She saw him look at her once, across the distance of the yard, with an expression she recognized from other places and other circumstances. It was the look of someone who believed a problem was contained. The afternoon demonstration was, as far as Elena could determine from the contractor's sideline position she had been assigned, intended to showcase the unit's capabilities for a cluster of officers who arrived from the adjacent command facility around 1400 hours. 4 men in uniform with rank insignia she identified as mid to senior grade, not generals, but not junior officers either. The kind of audience for which Voss would want to put on a genuinely impressive display. He ordered all 18 dogs into the main yard. Elena saw Titan's kennel door open for the first time all day. 2 handlers went in. 2, not 1, which told her something, and brought him out on a double-lead arrangement that she had not seen used on any other animal in the facility. Titan walked with them without fighting it, but his body language was wrong in ways she could see clearly from 60 feet away. He was too controlled. Not calm, controlled. There was a difference, and it mattered. She moved her position slightly, closer to the fence, staying within her designated contractor boundary but gaining a better sightline to the full yard. Voss began the exercise. He was running the dogs through a synchronized obedience sequence, a show exercise, impressive to watch, all 18 animals moving through command patterns in coordinated groups. The handlers were good. The dogs were capable. For the first 4 minutes, everything ran exactly as intended. The construction crew working on the new administration building. 300 yards northeast of the training yard had been audible all day, a low background percussion of heavy equipment and occasional power tools. Elena had stopped consciously registering it hours ago. Apparently, the dogs had not entirely stopped registering it. The sound that broke the exercise was not a gunshot or an explosion. It was a steel beam being dropped onto a concrete pad, a single massive impact that sent a shockwave of noise rolling across the base. In a civilian context, it would have been startling. In a training yard full of animals whose nervous systems had been conditioned by years of combat exposure to treat sudden explosive sounds as potential threats, it was something different entirely. The reaction moved through the yard in under 3 seconds. Titan went first. He came off his feet with a force that yanked the double lead out of one handler's grip entirely and left the other staggering. What happened next was not a directed attack. It was panic, pure and kinetic, an animal acting on survival instinct that training had sharpened but never fully overwritten. And because Titan moved, the dogs nearest to him picked up the signal, and then the ones nearest to them did. And within 15 seconds, the synchronized demonstration had become something that looked, from Elena's position at the fence, like a controlled system breaking apart at the seams. Handlers shouted. Commands overlapped and canceled each other out. 3 dogs on long leads tangled together. One handler went down on one knee from a leash impact. Voss's voice cut through the noise with practiced authority, trying to reestablish order, but he was using force escalation, louder commands, harder corrections. And it was making everything worse in exactly the way she would have predicted if anyone had asked her, which no one had. She heard one of the visiting officers say something sharp to the man next to him. She did not catch the words, but she caught the tone. She was already moving before she made a conscious decision to move. The gate to the main yard was a sliding chain-link panel, latched but not locked from the outside during active exercises. A safety measure, she assumed, intended to allow rapid entry in an emergency. Elena put her hand on the latch and looked at Krebs, who was standing 3 feet away watching the chaos with her tablet clutched to her chest and her face pale. "Don't," Krebs said. It came out as something between a command and a plea. "Go get Voss," Elena said, and pushed the gate open. The noise level inside the yard was significantly worse than it had sounded from outside the fence. She could feel it physically, not just in her ears but across her skin. That particular frequency of combined animal and human distress that bypassed conscious processing and hit something older. She stopped walking the moment she was 3 steps inside the gate. She stopped and she stood still. Not frozen. Still. There was a difference she had learned a long time ago in places that were louder and more dangerous than this training yard. Frozen was what panic looked like from the outside. Still was what control felt like from the inside. She watched the yard, mapped it, identified which dogs were in genuine distress and which ones were reacting to the energy of other dogs rather than to the initial trigger. Identified the 3 animals who were closest to the tipping point between panic and escalation into something that would require much more intervention than she was capable of providing alone. Titan was 12 feet to her left, back on both his handlers' leads now, but pulling hard enough that both men were visibly struggling to hold ground. I was vocalizing them, not barking, a deeper sound, more urgent, the sound of an animal that had been pushed past its threshold. Elena did not look at him directly yet. She had learned that too, in those other places. You did not make direct eye contact with an animal at the edge of its limits until you had given it something else to process first. She let Titan register her presence peripherally, continued the still-standing posture. Let her breathing audibly slow. Not performed, actually slow, the physiological result of a deliberate technique she had practiced until it was automatic. Around her, the yard was still loud and still chaotic. Handlers were shouting her name now, or shouting at her. She could not always tell the difference. One of the visiting officers had moved to the fence. She was aware of all of this the way she was aware of weather. Present, registered, not the primary focus. She turned her head slowly and looked at Titan. He was looking at her already. She held his gaze, not challenging, not submissive, simply present. She brought her right hand up slowly, open-palmed, held it at mid-chest height, and she said one word. One quiet word that the handlers nearby could not make out clearly because it was not English, was not any language in the current unit's command vocabulary, was something older than the training protocols and the military systems and the operational authorities that had been arranged around this yard like furniture around an empty room. Titan stopped pulling. Not gradually. Stopped. The leads went slack simultaneously, startling both handlers badly enough that one of them actually stumbled forward a step. Titan sat down, and then Elena turned slowly, quarter turn at a time, and looked at the other dogs in sequence, and the words she said carried differently each time. Not louder, not softer, but changed in some register that was difficult to articulate later, when people tried to describe what they had witnessed. And each dog she addressed lowered itself from agitation into something that was not quite calm but was no longer dangerous. It took 4 minutes, possibly less. Later, when people tried to reconstruct the timeline from multiple accounts, they disagreed on the duration because none of them had been watching a clock. They had been watching a woman stand motionless in the center of 18 war dogs and do something that none of their training told them was possible. The yard was quiet. Not completely. Handlers were still moving, still checking leads, still talking in low, urgent voices to each other. But the particular quality of noise that meant crisis was gone. The dogs were down. 18 animals that moments ago had been a collective emergency were now distributed across the yard in varying postures of rest and watchful stillness. Voss was standing 15 feet from Elena when she finally turned to face the direction of the operations building. She did not know what she expected his face to look like. She had seen a version of this expression before. The particular blankness of someone whose operational framework has just been conclusively demonstrated to be insufficient. But the specific combination on Colton Voss's face was something she read carefully before she said anything. He was not just surprised, he was recognizing something. She could see it working through him slowly, the way recognition sometimes worked when the thing being recognized carried implications you were not ready to process. One of the visiting officers had come through the gate behind her at some point during the intervention. She had not heard him enter, had been too focused to track peripheral movement, and he was standing several yards to her left, watching her with an expression that was not surprise at all. His name tape read, Hargrove. He was looking at her the way someone looks at a person they know from a context they did not expect to encounter here, in this place, on an ordinary Tuesday in a training yard that was no longer in crisis. Marlowe, he said. Not a question. Elena looked at him. Colonel Hargrove. Voss's head turned from one of them to the other. His jaw was tight. Someone, Hargrove said, reaching into the breast pocket of his uniform jacket, needs to tell me why her name isn't on anything in this facility's official records. He removed a folded document. Not a phone, not a tablet, a physical document, the kind of thing that got printed and signed when digital records were considered insufficient. Because according to what I've been carrying since this morning, it should be. Voss opened his mouth. Hargrove held up one hand and Voss stopped. At ease, Staff Sergeant, Hargrove said, in the specific quiet tone that senior officers used when they were not making a suggestion. He looked at Elena again. I think we need to have a conversation. Behind them, Titan was sitting in the middle of the yard with his ears forward and his eyes fixed on Elena's back with an intensity that several of the handlers would later say made them uncomfortable in a way they could not adequately explain. Like a dog waiting for someone it had been looking for to turn around and acknowledge it was still there. Like a dog who remembered. Hargrove did not wait for a conference room. He walked to the near side of the training yard fence, away from the handlers who were still working to settle the last of the agitated dogs, and he unfolded the document he had pulled from his jacket pocket and held it out to Elena without preamble. She took it. Read the first paragraph. Read it again. It was a memorandum from the Joint Military Working Dog Program Oversight Office, dated 11 days ago, bearing 3 signatures she recognized and 1 she did not. The subject line read, Operational Review, Raven Ridge K9 Division, Section 4, Training Protocol Assessment. The body of the document was dense with the specific language of bureaucratic concern. Phrases like documented performance degradation, accelerated washout rate, and handler injury frequency inconsistent with comparable units. But the meaning was clear enough once you stripped the formality away. Someone in the oversight structure had been watching Raven Ridge for a while, and something had finally pushed them to act. How long have you been carrying this? Elena asked. Since Monday. Hargrove folded his arms. He was a lean man, early 50s, with the kind of face that had stopped giving away anything it didn't choose to give away sometime in his late 30s. She had worked with him once before, briefly, under circumstances she did not intend to explain in this yard in the next 10 minutes. We were scheduled for a standard protocol review next week. What happened this afternoon moved the timeline. He nearly lost control of his entire unit in front of senior command, Elena said. Yes. Hargrove glanced toward Voss, who was standing 20 feet away with his hands at his sides and the expression of a man running through his options and finding all of them inadequate. Among other things, Voss had not moved since Hargrove raised his hand. He was not the kind of man who stormed off or made scenes in front of superior officers. Whatever his failures as a trainer, he understood military hierarchy well enough to know when he was in a situation that required him to stand still and wait. But Elena could see the tension in him from across the distance, the specific quality of a person holding themselves composed through effort rather than ease. Krebs had disappeared. Elena did not blame her. I need to ask you something, Hargrove said, keeping his voice low enough that it did not carry. Ask. The thing you did with the dogs. The command sequence. He paused. It was a deliberate pause, the kind that meant he was choosing words carefully rather than groping for them. That's not in any current training manual. No. But it worked. Yes. He looked at her steadily. I need more than one-word answers, Marlowe. She handed the memorandum back to him. It's in the original program documentation from 7 years ago, the one that was removed from the official curriculum in March of the year after I left active service. She said it flatly, without editorial. If your oversight office has access to the unredacted program archive, it'll be in there. Volume 3, Section 9. The Behavioral Recovery Protocols for Combat-Conditioned Working Dogs Presenting with Acute Stress Response. Hargrove tucked the document back into his pocket without breaking eye contact. And Voss's program. His training methods produce compliant dogs. They don't produce stable ones. There's a difference, and it compounds over time. She paused. Titan is the clearest example. He's not dangerous. He's depleted. What happened today was a dog hitting the floor of what he could tolerate, not a dog turning on his handlers. If someone had looked at his behavioral indicators 2 months ago with that distinction in mind, the incident that got him flagged for decommission probably wouldn't have happened. Can you document that? I've been documenting it all morning. Something in Hargrove's expression shifted by a degree that most people would not have caught. Elena caught it. Good, he said. I'm going to need that report filed directly to the oversight office, not through the facility chain. That's going to create a problem with Voss. I know. He finally looked away from her toward the yard where Titan was still sitting in the same position, watchful, still, 105 pounds of precision-bred working dog. Being absolutely patient in the way that working dogs could be when they had decided to wait. Let me deal with that. He walked toward Voss. Elena stayed where she was and watched. She could not hear what was said. She did not need to. The conversation lasted approximately 3 minutes, and its content was legible from the body language alone. Hargrove talking in the measured, authoritative cadence of someone delivering information rather than having a discussion. Voss listening with his jaw set and his hands very still. A moment near the end where Voss said something, a short sentence, sharp around the edges, and Hargrove responded with 2 words that made Voss look away first. Then Hargrove walked back toward the building, and Voss turned and looked at Elena directly for the first time since she had walked into the yard. It was not a pleasant look, but it was not the dismissive look from this morning either. This one had something underneath it that she recognized as more dangerous than simple contempt. This was a man recalibrating, She gathered her evaluation materials from where she had set them by the fence during the crisis and went to find a quiet space to finish her documentation. Krebs appeared out of nowhere as she was crossing toward the operations building, tablet still clutched to her chest, and fell into step beside her without being asked. "Are you okay?" Krebs said. "Fine." That was... She stopped. Started again. "I've never seen anything like that." "The dogs were never going to seriously injure anyone, Sis," Elena said. "They were scared. Fear is loud, but it's not the same as aggression. Most people can't tell the difference in the moment." Krebs was quiet for a few steps. "How did you know the command would work?" Elena considered the question. "I didn't know for certain, but the behavioral pattern I'd been watching in Titan all morning told me he was responding to stimulus overload, not to handler failure. That meant the underlying training was still intact. It just needed a different key." "A different key," Krebs repeated, like she was trying to file that somewhere useful. "What language was that?" "Old training vocabulary, not in current use." She pushed open the operations building door and went to the table she had used that morning, pulling out her notebook and her laptop and setting up to write. Krebs hovered in the doorway for a moment, then apparently decided she had somewhere else to be, and left. Elena wrote for 2 hours without stopping. She wrote with the particular focus that came from knowing the document she was producing mattered beyond the immediate situation, that it would be read by people who could either use it to make things better or use it to protect the status quo, and the quality of the writing would influence which outcome was more likely. She was not a natural writer. She had learned to write reports the way she had learned most of the things that defined her current life, by doing it under conditions that did not allow for anything less than competence. The evaluation covered all 18 dogs. For each animal, she documented physical indicators, behavioral indicators, stress response patterns, and specific training-related observations. The language was clinical and precise and would be difficult to argue with because it was based on observable, measurable data rather than interpretation. Where she included interpretation, she labeled it explicitly as such and provided the evidential basis for each conclusion. When she reached Titan's section, she wrote more carefully and more extensively than anywhere else in the report. She documented the isolation protocol, the double lead arrangement, the behavioral observations she had made from the contractor boundary before the crisis. And then, after a moment's consideration, she included a full account of the afternoon event and her intervention, including the specific command she had used and its theoretical basis, with a footnote reference to the program documentation she had mentioned to Hargrove. She was not certain the footnote would be understood without context. She added a second footnote. She was finishing this final section when the door to the operations building opened and Voss came in. He did not have anyone with him. It was late enough in the afternoon that the building was largely empty. The administrative staff had gone. Krebs was presumably somewhere on the grounds, and the handlers were running the post-exercise settling routines in the kennel blocks. He walked to the table where she was working and pulled out the chair across from her and sat down in it, which she had not expected. She looked up from her laptop. "I need to know something," he said. His voice was controlled, but it was doing a lot of work to stay that way. "Hargrove, did you know he was going to be here today?" "No." He studied her. "That's a short answer." "It's an honest one." She set her pen down. "I was dispatched as a contractor this morning to fill a gap in your medical evaluation schedule. I didn't know Hargrove was going to be at this base today, and I didn't know he was carrying an oversight memorandum. Those are facts." Voss was quiet for a moment. Around them, the building settled into the particular silence of a facility winding down from a difficult day, the kind of quiet that had texture rather than absence. "The command you used," he said. "In the yard." "Yes." "Where did you learn it?" "I developed it." She watched his face. "Or rather, I was part of a team that developed it. A behavioral recovery protocol for working dogs showing specific stress response patterns after extended combat exposure. We ran clinical trials over about 18 months, documented the outcomes, and submitted the full methodology to the Program Oversight Board for curriculum integration." She paused. "It was rejected." Voss's eyes narrowed slightly. Rejected. The review board at the time had a particular philosophy about working dog training. Their position was that behavioral modification after trauma was resource-intensive and produced inconsistent results. The more efficient approach, in their view, was to retire affected animals and bring up fresh dogs from the training pipeline. She kept her voice even. Our data showed that was wrong. It showed that with the right intervention methodology, most dogs presenting with what our team categorized as combat stress response could be returned to functional service. Not all of them, but most. And the board disagreed. The board had commitments to contractors who supplied the training pipeline. New dogs from those contractors cost money, but they also generated consistent contract revenue. Dogs returned to service through behavioral recovery did not. She let that sit for a moment. Our methodology was rejected. The documentation was removed from the official curriculum archive. The team was reassigned. I left active service 6 months later. Voss was very still. You're telling me Titan is a dog who should have received intervention 2 months ago and instead received isolation and a decommission flag. She turned the laptop to face him, showing him Titan's section of the report. Look at the behavioral indicators in column 4. Every one of those is documented in the recovery protocol literature as a response to inadequate post-trauma support. None of them is a primary aggression indicator. Not one. He looked at the screen. The particular stillness of him during this had a different quality than the controlled rigidity from earlier. This was not a man holding himself composed. This was a man actually reading something and processing it. The bite incident, he said, not looking up, was a pain response. He was pushed into a command sequence while his stress indicators were already in the red zone. A dog in that state bites because it's the only communication tool it has left. She closed the laptop. You didn't know that because no one gave you the framework to identify it. That's not an excuse for what happened to the handler, but it is an explanation. He looked up. That sounds like you're making a case for me. I'm explaining a system failure. The system failure goes back further than your tenure here. You inherited a training philosophy that has gaps in it, and you ran it the way you were trained to run it. The gaps aren't your fault. She held his gaze. What happens from here is... He sat back in the chair. A long beat of silence. The oversight review, he said, is going to find what it finds. I can't influence that, and I wouldn't try. She gathered her notebook and began organizing her materials. But my evaluation report is going to the oversight office with a full account of what I observed today, including the intervention and its outcomes. That's accurate documentation of what happened. What the oversight office does with it is their decision. He was quiet again. She could not tell what he was thinking, which was unusual. She was generally good at reading people, had spent years doing it under conditions that made accuracy non-negotiable. Voss had a face that had been trained, probably over years and probably with effort, to not be fully readable. It was a useful skill. It was also a kind of armor that, like most armor, had a cost. She picked up her bag. The program you described, Voss said, when she was halfway to the door. The recovery methodology. She stopped. Is it still documented anywhere, somewhere outside the official archive? She turned. He was still sitting at the table, the laptop closed in front of him, his hands flat on the surface on either side of it. Yes, she said. She left the building. The drive back to Kellerton was 40 minutes she spent not listening to the radio. She kept the window down even though the evening air had gone sharp and cold, because the chill kept her focused in the way that discomfort sometimes did. Not comfortable, but clarifying. She ran through the day in the specific way she ran through difficult days, looking for what she had handled well and what she had handled less well and what she would need to do differently going forward. The report was strong. She was confident in that. Hargrove's presence and his memorandum gave her documentation a cleaner path to the oversight level than it would otherwise have had, and the afternoon's events had produced observable evidence of the kind that was very difficult to dismiss. But she knew, from experience, how these things went. Reports got filed, reviews got conducted. People with authority and organizational interest in a particular outcome had more tools for shaping results than contractors with good data and correct instincts. The documentation was necessary, but not sufficient. It never was. She parked outside her apartment building and sat in the car for a moment before going in. She thought about Titan sitting in the middle of the yard after the intervention, watching the other dogs settle, ears forward, some quality of attention in him that was different from anything she had seen in him earlier in the day. Not calm exactly. A working dog that had been through what Titan had been through did not arrive at calm easily or quickly, but present, oriented, like a system that had been running on emergency backup power and had just received a signal that the main grid was still there. She went inside. She ate something she could not remember eating 20 minutes afterward. She made a phone call to the contractor dispatch coordinator and filed a brief verbal report of the day's events, as required by protocol, keeping the language factual and general. She sent the written report to Hargrove's direct line at the oversight office at 9:47 p.m., along with a cover note that was 3 sentences long. She was in bed by 10:30. She was awake again at 2:14 in the morning because her phone was ringing. The number on the screen was one she did not immediately recognize. Area code she placed as Regional Military Administration, local prefix. She answered it. The voice on the other end was not Hargrove. Ms. Marlowe. A woman's voice, precise and professional, and carrying something underneath it that Elena could not categorize immediately. My name is Major Delara Osei. I'm with the Joint Military Working Dog Program Oversight Office. I'm calling because I've been reading your evaluation report for the past 2 hours. Elena sat up. It's late for an oversight call. I work unusual hours. A pause that was not uncomfortable, deliberate. The intervention you documented in Section 7. The command protocol you used. I need you to be very specific with me about its origins. I explained that in the footnotes. I read the footnotes. I need you to explain it to me directly, not through documentation. Elena looked at the window. Outside, Kellerton was doing whatever a mid-sized city did at 2 in the morning, which was mostly nothing. The protocol was developed by a 4-person team during an 18-month trial period. The results were documented and submitted to the program board in the year I left active service. The submission was rejected, and the documentation was subsequently removed from the official archive. Subsequently removed? Osei repeated. That's a careful phrase. Yes. Not lost. Not archived. Removed. Correct. A longer pause. When Osei spoke again, her voice had shifted slightly. Not softer, but more direct. Miss Marlowe, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to understand that I'm not asking on behalf of the oversight review that Colonel Hargrove is leading. I'm asking on behalf of a separate inquiry that has been running for approximately 4 months. Elena felt something go still in her chest, not the practiced stillness, the involuntary kind. What kind of inquiry? She said. The kind that starts when someone in a program oversight position notices that the official records of a major training methodology trial have been inconsistently maintained. Osei's voice was steady and careful. The kind that expands when that someone starts pulling on threads and finds that the removal of those records coincides very precisely with a series of contract renewals worth approximately $38 million to 2 specific vendors in the training pipeline supply chain. The apartment was very quiet. Elena could hear her own breathing. We have the records, Osei said, the ones that were supposed to be gone. Someone made copies before the removal, and those copies have been in a secure evidence file for the past 4 months. Another pause. Your name is on the original submission document, Ms. Marlowe, as the lead author. Elena said nothing. I need to know if you're willing to cooperate with the inquiry, formally and on record. She looked at the window again. Kellerton. Her apartment. Her coffee that had gone cold that morning before she drove to a base she had not expected to affect her the way it had. Tell me about the other 3 people on the team, Elena said. Not an answer, a question. Osei hesitated. It was the first hesitation. 2 are still in active service, 1 retired. All 3 were contacted in the preliminary phase of the inquiry. All 3 declined to participate. Why? Various reasons. Career considerations. One of them has family circumstances that made the exposure risk unacceptable to him. Osei stopped. The point is that you are currently the only named team member who filed an independent report today that corroborates the inquiry's core findings through direct field observation. You are, at this moment, the clearest evidentiary thread we have. Elena closed her eyes, opened them. I'm not in active service anymore, she said. No, that's actually of why I'm calling you. Something in Osei's tone shifted again, this time into something that was careful in a different way. Careful in the way of someone who understood they were asking something that cost the person they were asking. A civilian contractor's independent evaluation carries different weight than active duty testimony in this type of inquiry. It's harder to suppress. harder to categorize as internal disciplinary matter rather than systemic failure. She let that land. Elena sat with it for a moment. "I need time to think," she said. "I understand. You have until 0800 tomorrow. After that, the inquiry moves to its next phase with or without your formal participation." Ose paused. "For what it's worth, say what you did today, in that yard." "I've been in this office for 9 years. I have never read an evaluation report that made me want to call the author at 2 in the morning before." The call ended. Elena set the phone down on the nightstand and looked at the ceiling of her apartment and thought about a dog sitting in the middle of a training yard with its ears forward and its eyes fixed on a specific point, waiting with the particular patience of something that had not given up but had run out of ways to ask for help. She thought about a document that had disappeared from an official archive on a specific date that she could name without looking it up, because she had been in the room the day someone told her the submission had been rejected, and she had known then, had known with the clarity that came from watching how institutions actually worked rather than how they claimed to work, that rejected was not the whole story. She thought about $38 million. She thought about 2 vendors. She picked up her phone and did not call Ose back. Not yet. Instead, she opened the secure document storage application she used for contractor records and navigated to a folder that she had not opened in 3 years. A folder labeled with a project code that meant nothing to anyone who didn't already know what it contained. The files were all there. She had not known, when she made those copies, exactly why she was making them. She had told herself it was professional habit, that documentation was documentation, and you kept it because that was what you did. She had not let herself examine the reasoning too closely. She was examining it now. The files were dated, sourced, complete. 18 months of trial data, behavioral assessments, outcome measurements, methodology documentation, correspondence records, including, in a subfolder she had not opened since the month she left active service, a chain of internal emails between 3 members of the Program Oversight Board discussing the submission review process. She read the emails again for the first time in 3 years. They were worse than she remembered. She sat there in the dark of her apartment at 2:40 in the morning with the evidence of something that had been buried for years sitting open on her phone screen, and she understood, clearly, in the way that clarity sometimes arrived not as a clean sensation, but as a heavy one, that Ose's timeline of 0800 was not the real deadline. The real deadline had been 7 years ago, and she had missed it. She was not going to miss this one. She got up, made coffee, sat at her kitchen table, and began going through the files one by one to identify which ones would be most useful to an inquiry that had been running for 4 months and had just found its clearest evidentiary thread. She was still at the table when her phone rang again, just before 5 in the morning. Different number this time, the local, not military administration. She answered it. It was Krebs. The specialist's voice was stripped of its usual brightness, down to something quieter and more urgent. "Ms. Marlowe, I'm sorry to call this early. A pause. Something happened at the facility tonight. I thought you should know." "What happened?" "Titan's kennel. Someone accessed it after the evening rounds. The access log was manually cleared, but one of the night handlers noticed the entry tag on the kennel door had been tampered with." Krebs's voice had gone tight. "He's gone, Ms. Marlowe. Titan is gone, and no one filed an authorized transfer paperwork." Elena was already moving before Krebs finished the sentence. "Who has access to the kennel block at night?" she said, phone wedged between her ear and shoulder while she pulled on her jacket with one hand. "Authorized handlers and facility command. That's it. The access system requires a badge scan and a PIN. The log should show every entry automatically." "But it was cleared." "Yes. Manually cleared means someone with administrative access to the security system. That's not a handler." She grabbed her keys. "How long ago did the night handler notice?" "Maybe 20 minutes. He called me because he didn't know who else." Krebs stopped. "He was scared to call Voss." That told Elena something. "Call Hargrove's office. Not his personal line. The oversight office main number. There's a duty officer on rotation. Tell them exactly what you told me and tell them the access log was manually cleared. Will they? Tell them. Do it now." She ended the call. The drive back to Raven Ridge at 5 in the morning took 31 minutes because there was no traffic, and she did not drive carefully. She ran through what she knew in the specific way she had been trained to think through developing situations. Not linear, not catastrophizing, but mapping the decision tree of what had happened and why, which branches were possible, which were probable. Titan's removal was not spontaneous. Spontaneous did not involve manual log clearance, which required planning and system access. This was someone who knew the investigation was coming and understood that a dog flagged for decommission who had just demonstrated the validity of a suppressed training methodology was a liability they could not afford to have in a kennel where investigators would be looking. The simplest interpretation was also the most alarming one. Someone had decided that a live dog who responded to Elena's command protocol was more dangerous to certain people's interests than a dog who had disappeared into an unauthorized transfer with cleared paperwork. She did not let herself think past that. The gate guard at Raven Ridge's main entrance was a different man than yesterday morning, younger and clearly running on the tail end of a night shift, and he looked at Elena's contractor badge and her face and the hour of morning with the particular expression of someone who had not signed up for complications. "I'm expected," she said, which was not exactly true but was close enough. He made a call. She waited. 40 seconds later, he waved her through with a look that suggested he was already planning to not remember this in his incident report. Krebs was waiting for her at the entrance to the kennel block, still in the civilian clothes she had apparently been wearing when she got the call from the night handler, a jacket pulled over what looked like clothes she had been sleeping in. She looked young and cold and steadier than Elena would have expected. The night handler was a man named Specialist Ortega, mid-20s, who had the compact, watchful quality of someone who paid attention to details because his job had taught him that ignoring details had consequences. He showed Elena the kennel door, the physical lock mechanism, where the entry tag had been physically reversed on the housing, a small but deliberate alteration that someone had done quickly and not quite carefully enough. "It was like that when I came through on the 2 a.m. check," he said. "I almost missed it. I almost just—" He stopped. "I've worked this block for 8 months. Titan's always in that run. When the run was empty, I thought it was a transfer, but there was no notice on the board, no paperwork on the clip." "Did you hear anything before the 2 a.m. check? Vehicles, movement?" "I heard a truck. I thought it was the maintenance crew. They sometimes come through early for the water system. I didn't go look." He said it evenly, without defensive inflation, which told her it was true. "I should have gone to look." "The truck direction. Which way did it leave?" "South gate. The maintenance vehicles use the south gate because it's closer to the utility access." He paused. "The south gate logs are separate from the kennel block system. Are they also manual clearable by the same administrative access level?" He thought about it. "No, south gate logs go to base security directly, different system." Elena looked at Krebs. Krebs was already pulling up something on her tablet. "I can't access the south gate logs," Krebs said, "but if you can get Hargrove's office to request them, I need a phone." Elena realized hers was in her jacket pocket and pulled it out. She had 3 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize and 1 from Hargrove's direct line, all in the past 40 minutes. She called Hargrove back first. He answered on the second ring, which meant he had not been asleep. "Marlowe." "Titan's gone. Someone removed him from his kennel between midnight and 2 a.m., manually cleared the kennel block access log, and used the south gate for egress. South gate logs are on a separate system, base security, not facility command." A pause that lasted exactly 3 seconds. "Where are you?" "Kennel block." "Don't move." He was not giving her a suggestion. "I'm 20 minutes out. Don't touch the kennel, don't let anyone else in there, and do not talk to Voss until I arrive." The call ended. She looked at Ortega and Krebs. "Neither of you goes anywhere either." They didn't argue, which she appreciated. The 20 minutes she waited were some of the more unpleasant 20 minutes she had experienced recently, and not because she was afraid. She was not afraid precisely. She was running on the particular alertness that came from sleep deprivation intersecting with high-stakes development, a state she recognized and had a functional relationship with from years of practice, but it was not comfortable. She stood outside the kennel block entrance and looked at the pre-dawn sky going from black to the specific deep blue that meant an hour until actual light. And she thought about a dog being loaded into an unauthorized vehicle in the dark, and she kept that thought tight and contained and did not let it become something larger than it needed to be right now. Hargrove arrived in 19 minutes with 2 other people she did not know. A woman in civilian clothes with a federal law enforcement credential that she showed briefly and did not explain, and a man in uniform with a legal affairs insignia. Not military police. legal affairs. That distinction mattered. Hargrove looked at Elena first. Are you all right? Fine, I haven't slept. Neither have I. He turned to Ortega. Walk me through exactly what you observed, starting from your midnight check. While Ortega talked, the woman with the federal credential went into the kennel block without touching anything, moving through it with a small handheld device Elena identified as a contact-free surface scanner. The legal affairs officer stayed at the entrance and started documenting on a tablet. Elena watched all of this from the position she had held for 20 minutes, aware that she was being useful primarily by staying out of the way and not contaminating what had become, without being formally declared as such, a secondary scene in an active investigation. After Ortega finished, Hargrove came to stand beside Elena. The South Gate logs, she said. Base security is pulling them. I requested it 8 minutes ago. He paused. There's more. She waited. The inquiry office received an anonymous communication at approximately 3 a.m., an email to the Oversight General inbox routed through a forwarding service, so the origin is obscured but not impossible to trace. He looked at her. It contained a summary of your team's original submission document. Not the full document, a summary with specific reference to the contract renewal timeline that the inquiry has been tracking. Elena went still. Someone else knows about the inquiry. Someone else has known for longer than we have. The summary document was too specific to be assembled from public information. Whoever sent it had access to the same internal records the inquiry has been working from. He let that sit, which means either there's a second source inside the system who has been waiting for the right moment, or someone panicked when I filed my evaluation report last night and decided that getting ahead of the inquiry was better than hoping it went away. She thought about the timeline. Report filed at 9:47 p.m. Titan removed from his kennel before 2 a.m. Communication sent to the oversight office at 3 a.m. That was a sequence, not a coincidence. Someone read my report. Your report went to my direct line. The access log on that mailbox is... He stopped. She watched him recalibrate. Should be limited to oversight personnel. But the kennel block administrative access was also supposed to be limited. She kept her voice level. You have someone inside the oversight office who is communicating with whoever moved that dog. Hargrove's face did the thing she had noticed the day before, the not giving away anything discipline. But it was working harder this time. That's a serious allegation. It's a logical conclusion from a sequence timeline. I'm not alleging it. I'm telling you what the events suggest. He was quiet for a moment. The sky had gone from deep blue to something lighter, the false dawn that looked like progress but wasn't quite. The communication included one other thing, he said. A name. She looked at him. A colonel. Retired now, 4 years out of active service. He chaired the program oversight board during the period when your team's submission was rejected. Hargrove said the name. Brennick. Colonel Aldrich Brennick. She knew the name. Of course she knew the name. He had been in the room. Not the room where she had been told the submission was rejected. The other room. The one where she was not supposed to know a meeting had taken place. The one she had found out about later from a conversation she had overheard and then spent 3 years trying to figure out what to do with. He retired to a consulting position, Elena said, with one of the 2 vendors in the training pipeline. Hargrove looked at her sharply. I knew that 4 years ago, she said. I didn't have documentation that connected it to the submission rejection. I had a timeline and a strong suspicion and nothing that would hold up to formal scrutiny. She paused. The emails in my files might be enough. I was going to go through them tonight. You have files. I made copies before I left active service. I opened them at 2:30 this morning. Something moved through Hargrove's expression that she read as a complicated mixture of things. And he said, I need those files, Marlowe. I know. She pulled out her phone. I'll send them to you right now. The same secure line I used for the evaluation report. She navigated to the folder with the project code. Her thumb hovered over the transfer option. Colonel. What? Brennick. If he's in that communication, if someone named him specifically, they did it because they want him caught, which means they know where this is going and they've made a calculation about what they're willing to sacrifice. She looked at Hargrove. Titan wasn't moved to protect a dog. He was moved to pressure someone, either to prevent me from being able to demonstrate the protocol again, or... She stopped, thought it through one more step. Or as a message to whoever sent that communication. Hargrove said nothing for a moment. Then, you think the person who sent the communication is someone who was involved in the original suppression? I think the original suppression involved more than one person, and not all of them were willing participants. And I think 7 years is a long time to carry something like that. She completed the file transfer and held up her phone to show him the confirmation. I also think whoever moved Titan knows where he is, which means if we find the truck, we find the dog. And wherever the dog is, there's a physical record of an unauthorized transfer that someone is going to have to explain. The federal credential woman came back out of the kennel block. Vehicle contact trace on the gate pad, she said without preamble. Partial plate. Enough for a match query if base security gives us the Southgate camera footage. Request is in, Hargrove said. Then we wait. She went back to her tablet. Elena sent the files and pocketed her phone. Krebs had materialized next to her at some point and was standing close enough that Elena could feel the tension in her. What happens now? Krebs said quietly. Now we see if the Southgate cameras were also on a clearable system. They were not. The footage came through to Hargrove's tablet at 6:23 a.m., pulled by base security at his direct request. He watched it first, then turned the tablet so Elena could see. The timestamp read 0147. The Southgate camera covered a wide angle of the exit lane and the surrounding access road. The vehicle was a dark-colored cargo truck, not military issue, civilian with a covered bed. It sat at the gate for 40 seconds while the guard on duty checked something, then was waved through. The plate was partially visible. The partial matched the gate pad contact trace. But what the camera had also captured, which the plate trace alone would not have shown, was the interior of the cab for approximately 2 seconds when the gate's overhead light swept across the windshield at the right angle. 2 people in the front seat. The driver Elena did not recognize. The passenger was Colton Voss. She looked at the image for a long moment, then looked at Hargrove. He was already reaching for his phone. The next 3 hours moved with the grinding logic of institutional processes engaging at high speed, which was to say they moved both faster than normal and slower than urgency demanded. Hargrove made calls. The federal credential woman, who Elena eventually learned was named Agent Solis from the Defense Contracting Fraud Division, made her own calls. The legal affairs officer had filled 2 pages of his tablet and started a third. Voss was not on the base. His vehicle was in the lot. He had left in the civilian truck, and his quarters were empty. His phone was going to voicemail. Elena worked from the kennel block entrance, making herself useful in the specific way she knew how to be useful in situations where she did not have authority. She documented, she organized, she answered questions from Solis and the legal affairs officer with precision and without editorializing. She gave them the emails from her files one by one as they requested them, in chronological order, walking them through the correspondence chain that documented how the program board had conducted the rejection process. The emails were damaging in the specific, devastating way that internal correspondence always was, when it showed people behaving as though they would never be read by anyone outside the room. There was no explicit statement of corrupt intent. People who did things like this rarely produced explicit statements. But there was a pattern of language across the chain that, read in sequence, showed a decision being made before the review process it was supposedly the product of. Questions answered before they were asked. Conclusions written before the methodology was assessed. And one email, 4 messages into the chain, with a recipient list that included an external address belonging to a consulting firm, sent while the submission was technically still under review. The consulting firm, Elena had confirmed 3 years ago and confirmed again this morning, was the company Brennick had joined 4 months after his retirement. Solis read that particular email twice. Then she looked at Elena. "You've had this for how long?" 7 years. "Why didn't you submit it to the oversight board?" "I did. 18 months after I left active service. Submitted it to the then current oversight board chair with a full written account." Elena kept her voice even. The submission was acknowledged and then closed without action on the grounds that the correspondence was insufficiently specific to warrant investigation. Solis made a sound that was not quite a word. Closed by whom? The chair at the time, a colonel named Whitfield. He retired 14 months later. Elena paused. To a different consulting firm, one with a contract relationship with Brennick's company. The silence that followed that particular sentence was the kind that had weight in it. At 9:41 a.m., base security located the civilian truck on footage from a highway camera system 12 miles north of Raven Ridge. It had taken the Northern Interstate Exchange toward the regional freight depot outside a town called Carver Falls, approximately 40 minutes from the base. Solis made a phone call. 30 minutes later, she received confirmation that a holding facility associated with a private veterinary transport company in Carver Falls had accepted delivery of one Belgian Malinois, no paperwork, paid in cash, at approximately 3 a.m. The dog was alive. The facility operator, when contacted by the investigative team, had apparently been under the impression that the animal was a civilian pet being temporarily housed while its owner resolved a housing situation. He had not asked for the military identification tag because he had not seen the tag, Titan's collar, and identification hardware had been removed before delivery. A recovery team was dispatched. Elena heard the confirmation and stood in the kennel block entrance in the morning light, which had arrived properly by now, real daylight rather than the gray pre-dawn that had been all she had worked with since she arrived, and she allowed herself exactly the amount of feeling that she could process without it interfering with the work still in front of her. Then she put it away and went back to work. Voss was located at 11:15 a.m. at a diner 40 minutes from the base, sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee he had not touched, his phone face down on the table. He did not run when the federal agent and the two MPs approached the table. According to the brief account that filtered back to Elena through Krebs, who had positioned herself near the communications officer with the particular skill of someone who was very good at being present without being noticed. He had looked up from his untouched coffee when they came in and said, "I know." He did not resist. He did not explain. He did not implicate anyone else in the diner, though he would do that later extensively in an interview that Elena was not present for and would only learn the contents of in pieces over the following weeks. What she learned that afternoon from Hargrove in the facility's conference room, with Solis and the legal affairs officer both present and a recorder running on the table between them, was enough. Voss had known about the inquiry for 9 days, longer than Hargrove had been carrying the memorandum. He had been contacted by Brennick's consulting firm 3 weeks prior, informed that a review was coming, and told that if the review found evidence connecting the current training program failures to the original suppression of the behavioral recovery methodology, the exposure would extend upward through several levels of command that had been, over the years, recipients of various forms of consideration from the vendors in question. He had not created the corruption. He had inherited a program built on it and had not asked enough questions about its foundations. That distinction mattered legally. It mattered less, Elena thought, in every other sense. What he had done in the 18 hours between the oversight memorandum's arrival and Titan's disappearance was make a series of decisions that collapsed the distinction faster than anything else could have. He had accessed the kennel block log system using his facility command credentials. He had arranged the truck. He had made a calculation that a dog who could not be examined could not provide evidence of anything. It was the calculation of a man who understood operations but not, fundamentally, how inquiry worked. He thought removing the dog removed your ability to demonstrate the protocol, Hargrove said. He thought wrong, Elena said. The protocol documentation exists independent of any demonstration. The evaluation report exists. The emails exist. Titan's behavioral record exists. The dog was never the evidence. The dog was the visible symptom of a systemic failure that was documented before anyone touched a fence gate last night. Hargrove nodded slowly. The question now is scope. How far up the contractor relationship goes. Whether Brennick acted alone in the board, or whether he had explicit coordination with others. He looked at her. That's where the inquiry goes next. It's going to take time. I know. And it's going to require formal testimony from you. She had known that since 2 in the morning. Yes. Solis leaned forward slightly. Miss Marlowe, I want to be direct with you about something. The inquiry is solid. The documentation is strong. But testimony from the lead author of the suppressed methodology, given under oath in a formal proceeding, is the difference between this ending quietly with a few administrative actions and ending with the kind of findings that actually change how this program operates going forward. She paused. The people who made certain your work disappeared once before. They will attempt to make your credibility disappear now. I know that too. Elena looked at her evenly. I've been aware of how that works for 7 years. It's not a new development. And you're still willing to proceed. Yes. There was a brief silence. Hargrove cleared his throat. There's one more thing. The communication we received at 3 a.m., the one that named Brennick. She waited. We traced the routing service. It took most of the morning, but we have a source location. The email originated from a device registered to a retired warrant officer named Prescott Lund. He said the name carefully, watching her. He was the third member of your original 4-person team. Elena went very still. Lund. She had not thought of Prescott Lund in 3 years, had deliberately not thought of him since the last time she had tried to contact him, 2 years after leaving active service, a call he had answered and then declined to continue in the same 30 seconds. He had said he could not talk about it. He had said he was sorry. He had ended the call. He declined to participate in the preliminary inquiry phase, she said. He declined formally, but apparently he didn't stop watching. Hargrove looked at her. He knew about the anonymous communication. He used it as a way to hand us what he knew without formally exposing himself. A pause. He also attached a second document to the communication, one the inquiry hadn't seen before. What document? Hargrove opened a file on his tablet and turned the screen toward her. She looked at it. It was a signed authorization form, dated 4 months after her team's submission was rejected. It was a directive for the permanent removal of the methodology documentation from the official program archive, signed by 2 members of the program board and countersigned by someone in the financial oversight office of the relevant appropriations chain. Not a colonel, not Brennick, someone considerably higher. Elena read the name on the countersignature line and felt the particular quality of recognition that was not surprise because some part of her had known, distantly, that this did not stop at the level she could see, had known it the way you knew something you had no evidence for and therefore had no useful relationship with. She had evidence now. That name, she said, is still in active service, Hargrove said, at the rank of general. The room was very quiet. Outside the conference room window, the training yard was empty in the late morning light. The 18 kennel runs arranged in their usual order, 17 of them occupied. The 18th was still empty, its gate standing open the way it had been left in the early hours of the morning when someone with something to protect had made the mistake of thinking that moving a dog would be the same as moving the truth. Elena looked at the signature on the form for a long moment. Then she looked up at Hargrove. I'm going to need a formal immunity agreement before I testify, she said. Not for me. For Lund. Whatever he's been sitting on for 7 years, he handed it to you at real personal cost. He deserves to not be destroyed for it. Hargrove looked at her steadily. That's not a small ask. No, she agreed. It isn't. Solis and the legal affairs officer exchanged a look that Elena did not have the angle to read clearly. Then Solis said, Write it up. What you need for him specifically, what protections, what scope. Put it in writing and I'll take it to the inquiry lead tonight. Elena nodded once, reached for the notepad in front of her. Her hand was not completely steady when she picked up the pen. She noticed that, registered it, and wrote anyway. She was 3 lines into the outline when her phone buzzed on the table with a message from an unknown number. Different area code than the military administration lines. Different prefix than anything in her contacts. She looked at the screen. The message was 4 words. They know about Lund. Elena looked at the message for exactly 3 seconds, then turned the phone face up on the table so Hargrove and Solis could both see the screen. Neither of them moved toward it immediately. They read it from where they were sitting. Unknown number, Elena said. Came in while I was writing. Solis was already reaching for her own phone. I need the device number. Read it to me exactly. Elena read it out. Solis stepped away from the table, talking low and fast into her phone. The legal affairs officer had gone still in the way of someone recalibrating their understanding of how much trouble they were actually in. Hargrove looked at Elena. Who else knew you were going to request protection for Lund? No one. I hadn't told anyone. I decided it in this room, in the past 10 minutes. Then either this room is compromised or someone with access to Lund's movements is watching him directly and anticipated the logical sequence. He stood up. Either way, we move Lund now. Do you have a location for him? The trace on the routing service gave us a residential address in Delmar County. 45 minutes east. He was already pulling up a contact on his phone. If someone moved before we did, they sent a warning instead of just acting, Elena said. That's a choice. Someone sent this message to me, not to Lund, which means they want us to know they know. That's either a threat or someone on their side who isn't fully on their side anymore, Solis said, coming back to the table. She had finished her call in under 2 minutes. We've seen that before. When an organization starts to crack under investigation pressure, the people on the edges start making contingency calculations. Someone in that network decided a warning to us was better than whatever the alternative was. They could have warned Lund directly, Elena said. Maybe they don't have his contact. Maybe they have yours because you filed a report last night that went to a compromised inbox. Solis looked at her. You're the visible element here. You walked into that yard and you did something that everyone present witnessed. You've been the center of the story since yesterday afternoon. From their perspective, you're the threat. But from someone on the inside who wants out, she stopped. You might also be the only person they trust to do something with what they're handing you. Elena looked at the message on her phone again. 4 words. No follow-up. No identification. Can you get to Lund before they do? She asked Hargrove. Making that call right now. He stepped out of the conference room. Elena set the pen down on the notepad, looked at the 3 lines she had written, and understood that the immunity framework she had started drafting was going to need to move faster than any formal process would naturally allow. Formal processes had timelines. Timelines assumed stable conditions. The conditions had not been stable since approximately 2:14 this morning and were getting less stable by the increment. Solis sat back down across from her. The counter-signature, the general. Yes. You recognize the name. Not from personal interaction. From the appropriations chain documentation I reviewed during the 18 months I spent trying to get the original suppression addressed. Elena organized her thoughts. His office had oversight authority over the program budget during the relevant period. I flagged his involvement as a possibility in my submission to the board 2 years after I left service. The board chair at the time, Whitfield, told me the appropriations chain was outside the scope of the review. Of course he did. Solis said it with the flat effect of someone who had stopped being surprised by this kind of thing several years ago. How solid is the documentation connection? The counter-signature on that authorization form is explicit. There's no interpretation required. His name, his signature, his authority line. Elena paused. But a signature on a document that removes methodology records from an archive is not the same as a signature on a document that authorizes vendor corruption. The inquiry will need to connect those dots with something I don't have. We have financial records going back 9 years, Solis said. If the connection is there, it's in the money. It's always in the money. She leaned forward slightly. What I need from you right now is a complete chronological account of every interaction you had with the program board during the original submission process and the 2 years after. Every meeting, every communication, every person you spoke to. I need names, dates, and whatever you remember about the substance. That's going to take time. We have time. What we don't have is the luxury of doing it slowly. She slid a fresh notepad across the table. Start from the beginning. Elena started from the beginning. She wrote for 90 minutes without stopping. In the longhand, she had defaulted to under pressure since her early training years, when someone had told her that handwriting forced a different kind of clarity than typing, and she had discovered it was true. The account was not literary. It was not organized for readability. It was the raw chronological record of a process she had spent 7 years trying to close, written out now in the specific detail that she had never been given a proper opportunity to give. And as she wrote, she was aware that she was also doing something she had not fully allowed herself to do before. Not in the 2 years of formal attempts, not in the 3 years of deliberate distance, which was to lay the whole thing out in order and look at it. It was worse, seen in full, than it had seemed in pieces. Not because the individual events were more dramatic. They were not. There had been no single confrontation, no clear villain moment, no obvious turning point where someone had looked her in the eye and made a corrupt choice in front of her. It was worse precisely because of how ordinary it had been. A review process that moved too quickly. A rejection letter with language that didn't match the submitted evidence. A meeting she was excluded from that she found out about 3 weeks afterward. Small obstructions, each individually explainable, that added up to something that could only be understood from a distance and required someone willing to look at the whole picture to see it clearly. Solis read each page as Elena finished it, making notes of her own in the margins. Hargrove came back into the conference room at 1:17 p.m. He sat down without preamble. Lund is secure. We had a team at his location within the hour. He was there. He hadn't been contacted by anyone, and he didn't know about the message to your phone. He paused. He wants to talk to you. Elena stopped writing. To me, specifically. To you specifically, before he talks to anyone official. He made that a condition. She looked at Hargrove. He looked back at her with the expression of someone who had decided not to have an opinion about this particular request. We can facilitate a call. Monitored, recorded. He knows that. Set it up. The call came through on a secure line 15 minutes later. Lund's voice was older than she remembered, roughened in a way that time and whatever the last 7 years had actually cost him had put there. But the cadence was the same. The particular rhythm of someone who chose words with the habit of a person who had learned that the wrong word at the wrong time had consequences. Marlowe, he said. Prescott. She had not said his name in 3 years. It landed differently than she expected it to. I've been watching the inquiry for 4 months, he said. I knew it was coming before the formal process started. I have contacts I kept. A pause. I should have come forward sooner. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. I know. She did not fill the silence. She had learned in that other context that Hargrove had referenced, and that she did not intend to explain in any conference room, that silence was a more useful tool than reassurance in certain kinds of conversations. The document I sent, Lund said, the authorization form. I've had that for 6 years. I got it from someone inside the Financial Oversight Office who gave it to me in a parking garage at 11 o'clock at night and told me she was going to deny everything if I ever named her. He paused again. She died 2 years ago, natural causes. So that particular complication is gone. Is there more? Beyond what you sent? There's a secondary contract record, a service agreement between one of the vendors and a shell company that traces back to the general's son-in-law. It's not clean. There are steps between that would need to be filled in, but it's real. Where is it? It's been sitting in a safe deposit box in a bank in Kellerton for 6 years, box registered in my sister's name. A short, humorless sound that was not quite a laugh. I drove past that bank 3 times a week for 2 years, wondering when someone was going to ask me the right question. Elena closed her eyes briefly, opened them. Prescott, why me? Why not file that through the inquiry directly? Because the inquiry started with a standard protocol review that got elevated. Standard protocol reviews at that level have a dozen people with access to the preliminary findings. I don't know which of those people are safe, he said it without drama. But I know you. I know you filed your evaluation report last night, and it went to a compromised inbox within hours, and you figured that out and kept going anyway. That's not someone who's been managed. She understood what he was saying. You need me to retrieve the document. I need someone who isn't in the official process chain to retrieve the document and hand it directly to Solis. Not through any internal routing, directly. He gave her the bank name and the box number and told her his sister's name and the secondary authorization code she would need to provide at the institution. He said it all in one clean sequence, like a man who had rehearsed this moment and was finally relieved to be saying it out loud. Marlowe. Still here. I'm sorry I didn't pick up the phone 2 years ago. She looked at the wall of the conference room. Outside, somewhere on the base, the training yard was running its afternoon schedule, with handlers and dogs and the ordinary machinery of a facility that did not yet know how much of its foundation was about to be formally examined. You picked it up now, she said, and ended the call. She went to the bank in Kellerton herself. Solis offered to send someone with her, and she declined, which Solis accepted with the pragmatic grace of someone who understood that some threads were best pulled by the person who had been attached to them longest. The legal affairs officer rode with her, which was a reasonable compromise. He stayed in the car. The bank was a 40-minute drive. The process at the institution took 11 minutes, including the time required for the branch manager to verify the secondary authorization code against the box registration, which he did with a thoroughness that Elena appreciated, even as it cost her time she was aware of spending. She carried the contents of the box out in a plain manila envelope that the branch manager provided, sealed it with tape he also provided, signed the outside of it, and handed it to the legal affairs officer through the car window with a chain of custody statement she gave him verbally, and he recorded on his tablet. She drove back to Raven Ridge. The secondary contract record was everything Lund had said it was. Solis spent 40 minutes with it, her financial analyst on the phone, going through the document in the specific way of someone who knew what they were looking for and had just found it in a form cleaner than they had expected. The shell company connection was traceable. The service agreement was dated. The amounts were specific. The general's name was not on this document. His son-in-law's name was on it. But the inquiry's financial records had been tracking the son-in-law's company for 3 months as part of a broader mapping of the vendor relationship network, and the service agreement created a documented link between that company and a contract period that coincided precisely with the suppression authorization Elena had signed her name to 7 years ago as the lead author of the rejected submission. The dots, as Solis had said, were in the money. They were connected now. At 4:30 p.m., Hargrove convened a formal meeting in the base commander's conference room, a room Elena had not previously been in, larger than the facility conference room and equipped with communication infrastructure that made it clearly intended for things more significant than routine facility management. Present were Hargrove, Solis, the legal affairs officer, the base commander whose name was Colonel Marek Duffin, a quiet man who had said very little all day and listened to everything, and a video link to the inquiry oversight lead in the program's central administrative office. Elena was in the room, not at the main table. Seated off to the side in the chair that Duffin's aide had placed there without being asked, with her notepad and her pen and the particular quality of stillness she had arrived at somewhere during the drive back from the bank, which was the stillness that came from having done the work and being now on the side of waiting for other people to do theirs. The video link was brief and highly specific. The inquiry lead had been reviewing material since morning. The secondary contract record was the piece that completed the financial chain. Formal investigative authority was being escalated. Subpoenas would go out within 48 hours, to Brennick, to the 2 vendors, to 3 other individuals identified in the financial mapping, and to the general's office. The general's name, spoken in that conference room by the inquiry lead on the video screen, landed in the room differently than names usually did. Not louder, heavier. Duffin, who had been quiet all day, said, "How long before this is public?" "That depends on how much cooperation we receive in the next 72 hours, the inquiry lead said. "We're hoping the speed of the formal process makes cooperation the more appealing option for several of the parties involved." "Hoping," Duffin said. "Anticipating." A pause. "The documentation is strong. There are people in this network who are going to run the math on what they're personally exposed to versus what cooperation would cost them, and that math is going to favor cooperation for most of them." Another pause. Most. The video link closed. Hargrove looked at Elena across the room. She looked back at him. The next 72 hours began. Brennick was the first to break, which surprised no one in the inquiry office and surprised Elena only slightly. He retained a lawyer at 6 a.m. the following morning and had requested a cooperation agreement by noon. The lawyer negotiated hard on the exposure terms and got less than he asked for, which was also not surprising. The documentation was strong enough that cooperation from Brennick, while useful, was not the fulcrum the inquiry had needed it to be a week ago. The 2 vendors retained separate legal representation and said nothing publicly. Their internal communications, subpoenaed and produced under the order that came through in 43 hours rather than 48, told a different story than their silence. Solis spent 2 days in a room with the financial records and emerged with a documented transaction history that showed a consistent pattern of payments routed through the shell company network over a 9-year period, coordinated with specific program decisions that included the submission rejection, 2 subsequent curriculum changes that benefited pipeline vendors, and 3 contract renewals at terms that a competitive bidding process would not have produced. $38 million, as Osei had said. It was closer to 51 when the full transaction history was mapped. Voss cooperated fully. This was, Elena thought, the least complicated element of the entire situation. A man who had been used by a system he had not fully understood, who had made one catastrophic decision in a moment of panic, and who was now doing the only thing left that served his interests. His account of the contact from Brennick's firm, the nature of the communication, the specific information he had been given about the inquiry's approach, all of it corroborated the financial record and the email chain and created a timeline of active interference that extended from 7 years ago to 48 hours ago without a significant gap. Elena gave her formal testimony on the third day. It took 6 hours across 2 sessions, with a break in the middle that she spent in a hallway outside the inquiry office eating a sandwich she did not particularly taste and talking to no one. The testimony covered everything in the chronological account she had written for Solace, plus the events of the past 3 days in the specific detail that formal testimony required. She answered questions from the inquiry lead, from Solace, from a military legal officer she had not previously met, and at one point from a civilian attorney who was representing one of the vendors, and who asked questions designed to establish that Elena's evaluation methodology was not credible. She answered those questions without raising her voice. She answered them with the specific supporting references that made each question's premise collapse under its own weight. The vendor attorney asked fewer questions as the session went on. Lund testified the following day. Elena was not present for that. She was back at Raven Ridge by her own request, finishing the work she had been contracted to do, the formal evaluation report, complete now, covering all 18 dogs with the full documentation that the original scope had required, and that the events of the past 4 days had expanded considerably beyond what a routine contractor assignment would normally contain. She was in the kennel block, sitting on the ground outside Titan's Run, with her back against the fence and her notepad on her knee, when the recovery team brought him back. He was thinner than he should have been, which was what happened to a high-performance working dog when its feeding schedule was disrupted, and its environment changed suddenly, and its stress indicators went through the kind of acute spike that 3 days in an unfamiliar civilian facility produced. He had a minor abrasion on his left shoulder from the transport crating that had not been properly sized for his body. He needed a proper veterinary examination and a nutritional adjustment and time. When the recovery team handler opened the transport gate and Titan came down the ramp on his lead, he immediately scanned the kennel block area with the particular efficiency of a working dog entering an unfamiliar space, threat assessment, environmental mapping, looking for something recognizable. He found Elena sitting on the ground against the fence. He went still. She did not move. She kept her breathing even and her posture loose, and her gaze directed slightly to the side of him rather than directly at him, the peripheral approach she had used in the yard 4 days ago, and she waited. The handler holding his lead looked at her with an expression of uncertainty. "Give him a moment," she said quietly. Titan walked forward. Not fast. Not with the urgency of a dog completing a command. With the specific deliberateness of an animal that had decided something on its own terms. He stopped 2 feet from her and stood there, and she turned her head and looked at him directly, and he looked back at her. And after a moment he sat down on the concrete with a sound somewhere between a sigh and an exhale that she felt in her chest in a way she did not try to analyze. She put her hand out, palm up, at knee level. He dropped his head and pressed his nose into it. The handler watched this. He looked like he was going to say something and then decided not to. Elena sat with Titan on the concrete until the veterinary team arrived, keeping her hand where it was, saying nothing. She was not performing calm. She was not demonstrating a technique. She was simply there, which was sometimes the only thing that was needed and the hardest thing to provide consistently, and she had learned that specific lesson in enough difficult places that it no longer required conscious thought. It was, she thought, the thing the program had never managed to put in a training manual. Not because it was too complicated, because it looked too simple, and things that looked too simple were very easy to dismiss as not real, not rigorous, not worth the budget line. She knew how that went. The veterinary assessment took an hour. Titan was stable, as she had assessed from observation, and the abrasion was superficial. The nutritional plan was adjusted. The stress indicators would need monitoring for 2 to 3 weeks. I was cleared to return to his kennel with a modified handling protocol. The double lead arrangement was removed from his management plan, effective immediately, by Elena's written recommendation and the base veterinary officer's formal endorsement. She filed both documents before she left the facility that evening. She was in her car, in the contractor lot, engine running, when her phone rang. Hargrove. The general's office was contacted by the inquiry legal team at 1700 hours today, he said. They requested a voluntary interview for next week. Was it accepted? His legal representative responded within 40 minutes. They're requesting a delay pending document review. Hargrove paused. Which is what you do when the documents are going to be damaging and you want time to construct a narrative around them. And the inquiry lead's response to the delay request. Denied. The interview is scheduled. Another pause. Elena. She had not heard him use her first name in 3 days. What? The general's name is going to be public within 72 hours. Not because the inquiry will release it, but because Brennick's cooperation agreement contains a disclosure provision and his lawyer is going to use it to create favorable press for his client before the formal findings come out. Once that happens, the story stops being about program administration failures and starts being about something considerably larger. He said it carefully. You need to be prepared for what that looks like. She looked through the windshield at the training yard fence, visible from the lot. Inside, the evening handler rotation was moving through the kennel blocks. Ordinary work. The ordinary machinery of a facility doing what it was supposed to do, imperfectly, day after day. I've been prepared for a long time, she said. I know. A pause. Get some sleep tonight, actual sleep. She ended the call and drove. She got actual sleep, approximately 5 hours of it, which was not a full night but was functional. She was awake at 5 a.m., not because her phone rang, but because her body had recalibrated to a schedule based on the last 4 days and was not yet done with it. She made coffee and sat at her kitchen table and opened the secure document application and looked at the folder with the project code. Most of the files had been formally submitted to the inquiry now, properly evidenced and logged. The folder felt different, not empty. There was still material in it, but lighter in a specific way that she noticed without being able to name precisely. She was on her second cup of coffee when the news alert came through on her phone. Not from a military source, a national news outlet, the kind with the infrastructure to receive a well-timed leak and the judgment to know what to do with it. The headline used the general's name in the second paragraph, behind a first paragraph that described what the story characterized as a major military contracting fraud inquiry targeting senior officials and 2 major defense vendors. The piece was sourced to unnamed individuals familiar with the inquiry, Brennick's lawyer working faster than anticipated, or someone else in the network running their own calculation about the value of being first. By 6:30 a.m., 3 additional outlets had picked it up. By 7, it was the leading item on 2 national defense reporting services. Elena read the coverage carefully, the way she read anything that contained information she already knew, looking for what was accurate, what was incomplete, what was missing, and what had been shaped by the particular interests of the people who provided it. The general's name was now public. Brennick's name was public. The vendor relationships were described in general terms. The suppressed methodology was mentioned in one paragraph as a training program modification whose rejection is now under review, which was both technically accurate and entirely inadequate. Her name was not in any of the coverage. Neither was Lund's. She set the phone down and drank her coffee and thought about that. About the fact that the story that was now spreading across the national defense press was accurate in its architecture and incomplete in its human content. That the thing that had made the investigation possible, the chain of decisions by specific people acting on specific knowledge at specific personal cost, was not visible in any version of the coverage she had read. That was usually how it went. She knew that. She had known it would go that way. She was not owed visibility in a news cycle. The work was what mattered, and the work was done, and whether the people who read the coverage ever understood exactly who had done it and what it had cost was not a thing she could control. She was thinking about this when her phone rang again. Number she did not recognize, but the area code was the same as Lund's original routing service trace. The Delmar County area, 45 minutes east. She answered it. Miss Marlowe. A woman's voice. Older, with a particular quality of composure that suggested someone who had spent a long time organizing her way of speaking around something difficult. My name is Harriet Lund. I'm Prescott's sister. Elena straightened. Mrs. Lund. He asked me not to call you. He said you'd probably prefer not to be contacted by people who are... She stopped briefly. He said you'd prefer clean lines. But I'm calling anyway because I've been the person whose name was on a safe deposit box for 6 years without knowing why, and now I know why, and I thought you should hear this from someone who isn't part of any official process." Elena waited. "Whatever it cost you," Harriet Lund said, "to keep going, for 7 years, without anyone on your side, whatever that actually cost you, day by day." She stopped again. A controlled stop, the kind that held something larger behind it. "My brother slept 3 hours a night for most of those 7 years. I watched him. I didn't know why, and I couldn't help. I'm calling to tell you that you gave him something back last week. That's real, whatever else happens." Elena looked out the kitchen window. The morning was fully light now, the kind of clear autumn morning that Kellerton produced occasionally between weeks of flat gray sky, and the light had that quality of something that didn't apologize for itself. She started to say something. Her phone buzzed in her hand, a second call incoming from Solis. Urgent, the way Solis called when things were urgent, which was identifiable from a single ring. "Mrs. Lund," she said, "I need to take another call. I'm glad Prescott is—" She paused, choosing the word. "I'm glad." She switched to Solis. "We have a problem," Solis said before Elena could speak. "The General's legal team filed an emergency motion at 7:45 this morning requesting that all contractor-sourced testimony and documentation be excluded from the inquiry record on the grounds that the contractor authorization process was procedurally compromised." Solis's voice was level, but moving fast. "They're claiming your original dispatch to Raven Ridge 4 days ago was not a routine contractor assignment. They have a document, and I need you to tell me right now whether this is real, that shows your name was flagged to the facility by a member of the oversight staff 12 days ago." Elena went still. "They're claiming," Solis continued, "that you were placed at Raven Ridge specifically to collect evidence for the inquiry, that your presence was not incidental, that everything you observed, documented, and testified to was the product of a pre-planned infiltration by someone inside the inquiry with a personal stake in the outcome." She paused. "If they can make that stick, the entire evidentiary chain gets challenged. Not just yours, Lund's, the financial records, all of it, because it traces back to what you found and when you found it." Elena was very still. "Elena," Solis almost never used her first name, "was your dispatch to Raven Ridge routine? Was it exactly what it appeared to be? A contractor filling a scheduling gap?" And Elena looked at the morning light coming through her kitchen window, and she thought about a dispatch call at 6:15 a.m. from a coordinator who said there was a gap in the schedule, and she thought about the unit designation in the briefing file that had made her put down her coffee and stand at the counter for a moment before picking up her bag. And she thought about the things that were true and the things that were complicated and the things that were both at the same time. "My dispatch was processed through the standard contractor network," she said. "I was assigned to fill a scheduling gap. Those are facts. And the rest of it," she closed her eyes. "I need to know what I'm defending, Elena." Elena opened her eyes. "Get me the dispatch authorization record," she said. "The original filing, the timestamp, the coordinator's name, and the name of whoever flagged the scheduling gap to the network. Get me all of it, and I'll tell you exactly what we're defending." The dispatch authorization record came through in 40 minutes. Solis sent it to Elena's secure line without commentary, just the file and a timestamp showing she had pulled it the moment she had the access to do so. Elena opened it at her kitchen table with her third cup of coffee going cold beside her and read it twice, carefully, looking at every field. The dispatch had been filed at 6:02 a.m. 13 days ago by a coordinator named Willa Tran at the Regional Contractor Network office. The scheduling gap had been flagged to the network by the Base Medical Liaison Office at Raven Ridge, specifically by the Medical Liaison's administrative assistant, who had submitted the gap notification through the standard protocol channel at 5:47 a.m. the same morning after the assigned military medical contractor confirmed they would be on leave. The chain was clean, time-stamped, procedurally ordinary in every visible element. Elena looked at the name of the person who had originally requested her contractor credentials be added to the Raven Ridge approved contractor list 14 months ago during a routine credential update cycle. The name was Hargrove. She sat with that for a long moment. Hargrove had added her credentials to the facility's approved list 14 months ago. That was administrative fact. It was also, she understood clearly, the thread the General's legal team was going to pull. The argument that Hargrove, knowing he would eventually be carrying an oversight review to Raven Ridge, had positioned a contractor with specific expertise and a personal history with the suppressed methodology to be available when needed. Pre-planned, coordinated, tainted. She called Solis back. I have the record, Elena said. Here's what's true. My credentials were added to the Raven Ridge approved list by Hargrove 14 months ago during a standard update cycle. My dispatch 4 days ago went through standard network channels in response to a genuine scheduling gap. Those two facts coexist. She paused. The legal team's argument depends on those two facts meaning the same thing. They don't. Can you establish that Hargrove had no knowledge the scheduling gap would occur? The gap was created when the assigned military medical contractor confirmed leave status at 5:47 a.m. on dispatch day. Hargrove wasn't in communication with Raven Ridge's medical liaison office. That's a facility-level administrative function that runs independently of command oversight. Elena thought through it step by step, the way she had been trained to think through procedures under pressure. Not from the conclusion backward, but from the facts forward. What I need is the timeline of when Hargrove was first briefed on the oversight review and when he received the memorandum. If he received the memorandum and was briefed on the Raven Ridge review scope after the dispatch was already processed, the coordination argument falls apart. Solis was quiet for several seconds. The memorandum went to Hargrove 11 days ago. The dispatch was processed 13 days ago. 2 days before Hargrove even had the oversight memorandum. Then the sequencing is clean, Elena said. The dispatch preceded the formal review assignment. Hargrove couldn't have positioned me for an inquiry he hadn't been assigned to yet. The legal team knows the sequencing, Solis said. They filed anyway. Because they're not trying to win that argument on the merits. They're trying to create enough procedural noise to get the testimony excluded while the formal findings are being compiled. Delay the evidentiary chain, create doubt about the integrity of the process, hope that something in the formal review gets disrupted enough to limit the scope of the findings. Elena had seen this before, in smaller contexts with lower stakes, and the mechanism was always the same. You did not fight evidence you could not beat by disproving it. You fought it by making the process that produced it look unreliable. The inquiry lead is reviewing the motion, Solis said. Hearing is set for tomorrow morning. I need a written statement from you today. Your account of the dispatch, the credential history, everything, time-stamped and under penalty of perjury. I'll have it to you by noon. She had it to Solis by 11:40. It was 8 pages, single-spaced, written with the same clinical precision as her evaluation report, but with a different quality underneath it. The quality of someone who had spent 7 years understanding exactly how institutional processes could be used as weapons, and who was no longer willing to be on the losing end of that particular dynamic. She did not write it angry. She wrote it exact, which was more useful and considerably more damaging to the motion's premise. The hearing the following morning lasted 3 hours. Elena was present in the room. Not testifying, present, seated in the observer section of the inquiry's formal proceeding space, which was a conference facility in a federal building 40 minutes from Kellerton. Hargrove was there, Solis was there. The general's legal team was there with 2 attorneys and a paralegal, and the particular aggressive composure of people who had been paid a significant amount of money to project confidence about an argument they knew was structurally weak. The inquiry lead was a woman named Dr. Vera Castine, a civilian attorney with a joint appointment to the Program Oversight Board, who had the quality of someone who had read every document in the case file and remembered all of it without needing to reference notes. She ran the hearing with the efficiency of someone who understood that procedural motions were sometimes legitimate and sometimes theater and had developed over years a reliable sense of which was which. She denied the motion in 40 minutes. Not because the argument was entirely without surface logic. She acknowledged, specifically and on the record, that the credential history created an appearance question that warranted transparency. But appearance questions were resolved through disclosure, not through exclusion of evidence. The sequencing of the dispatch relative to the oversight assignment was documented and unambiguous. The testimony and documentation produced by Elena Marlowe would remain in the evidentiary record. The general's lead attorney asked for a recess to consult with his client. The recess lasted 11 minutes. When it ended, the attorney requested a meeting with the inquiry lead and Solis outside the formal proceeding. Castine agreed. Elena stayed in the observer section with Hargrove, who sat beside her in the kind of silence that had content in it rather than absence. You knew the credential history was going to be an issue, she said, I knew it could be used as one. Yes. He did not look defensive about it. He looked like a man who had made a calculation and was prepared to account for it. Adding your credentials to the approved list 14 months ago was a decision I made because the program at Raven Ridge had indicators that were going to require evaluation eventually, and I wanted the right expertise available when that evaluation happened. That's an accurate description of my reasoning. That's also an accurate description of what their attorney called pre-planned positioning. The difference, Hargrove said, is intent. My intent was to have qualified medical evaluation capability available for a facility with documented performance problems. I was not planning an investigation. I was managing risk in a program I had oversight responsibility for. He paused. Those are different things, even if they look similar from a certain angle. Do you believe that? He looked at her. I believe it's true. Whether I believe it in the sense you mean, whether I think my hands are entirely clean on this, is a more complicated question. He said it without the diplomatic smoothing she might have expected from a man in his position. I knew your history with the program when I added your credentials. I knew what you had tried to do 7 years ago and what had happened to the attempt. I told myself that was professional knowledge relevant to the evaluation role. That's also true. And it's also true that I wanted someone in that facility who would not miss what was there to be found. She looked at the front of the room where the inquiry lead's table sat empty during the recess. Then we were both going into that yard with more than one purpose. Yes. A pause. Does that bother you? She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about things that deserved honest consideration rather than reflexive response. It would have bothered me more if the program was clean and the findings were nothing. Using someone's expertise and history to serve an institutional purpose they didn't fully consent to is a real problem when it doesn't produce something true. She looked at him. It produced something true. That doesn't make it clean. No, it doesn't. She looked back at the front of the room. But clean and true are different standards, and I've had to make my peace with that distinction more than once. Hargrove said nothing for a moment. Then, for what it's worth, I think you would have seen what was in that facility regardless of what brought you there. I know, she said. It was not arrogance. It was the specific confidence of someone who understood what they were capable of and had stopped apologizing for knowing it. That's the part that was never about you. The meeting between the inquiry lead, Solis, and the general's attorneys took 47 minutes. When Solis came back into the room, her face told Elena what she needed to know before any words were spoken. Not triumph. Solis did not do triumph as a visible expression, something quieter and more substantial. He's cooperating, Solis said, formal agreement being drafted now. He'll provide a full account of his involvement in the authorization chain, the contractor relationship, and the board communication during the suppression period. In exchange, the inquiry will consider his cooperation in the final sentencing recommendation. She sat down. His attorney fought hard for immunity. He didn't get it. He got consideration. Which is less than he wanted, Elena said. Significantly less. Solis looked at her. His account, his specific account of the board authorization process, is going to corroborate the emails and the contract records in ways that close the remaining gaps in the timeline. It's the last piece. Elena looked at the empty table at the front of the room. 7 years. She was not going to perform what she felt about that. She sat with it in the way she had learned to sit with large things, not pushing it away, not letting it expand beyond what was actually there. And after a moment she said, "What happens now?" Formal findings get compiled over the next 3 to 4 weeks. Then they go to the program board for action. Then the criminal referrals go to the appropriate offices. There will be criminal referrals for at least 3 parties, possibly more. Solis paused. Your testimony, your documentation, and your evaluation report will be central to the formal findings. Your name will be in the record. The suppressed methodology, Elena said. What happens to the curriculum integration question? Solis looked at her with something that took Elena a moment to identify as recognition. The expression of someone who had understood, probably halfway through this process, that the investigation was never the point for Elena. The investigation was the mechanism. That's a program board decision rather than an inquiry outcome. But the formal findings will include a specific recommendation regarding the operational review of current training methodology relative to the documented evidence base. She paused again. I'm told that recommendation is going to be strongly worded. By whom? Castine. Solis allowed herself something almost like a smile. She read the original submission document, all of it. She told me this morning it was the most thoroughly evidenced methodology proposal she had encountered in 9 years of program oversight work. Elena heard that and let it land in the specific way that accurate recognition landed after a long time of its absence. Not like vindication exactly, because vindication implied the injury had been undone, and injuries of that kind did not undo. It landed more like being told, clearly and without political softening, that the thing you had known was true had always been true, regardless of what anyone had decided to do with it. That was not nothing. It was, in fact, considerable. She went back to Raven Ridge that afternoon, not because she was required to. Her formal obligations to the inquiry were substantially complete. Her evaluation report had been submitted, and there was no procedural reason for a contractor to be on site beyond her assigned engagement period. She went back because Titan's modified handling protocol needed a follow-up observation assessment, and because the handlers she had watched on her first morning, the ones running obedience patterns with that slight wrongness in the dog's shoulder tension, the two watchful eyes, had been running the same methods for days since then without anyone providing them the specific framework that would let them see what she had seen. Krebs met her at the gate. The specialist looked less exhausted than she had at 5 a.m. 4 days ago, but not fully rested. The particular residue of a difficult week that sleep alone did not remove. "You didn't have to come back," Krebs said. "I know. Voss he's not here. He's been formally suspended pending the outcome." Krebs fell into step beside her. "The senior handler, Sergeant Baskin, is running the daily schedule. I know that too." Elena had read the facility status update that Hargrove's office had sent to all parties involved in the evaluation. "I need about 2 hours with the training team. Not an evaluation, a working session, if Baskin will allow it." Baskin turned out to be a woman in her mid-40s who had been at Raven Ridge for 11 years and who had watched everything that happened over the past 4 days with the expression of someone reserving judgment until they had more information than they currently possessed. She looked at Elena when she arrived at the operations building and said, "I read your evaluation report." "All of it?" "All of it." Baskin's expression did not change significantly. "The behavioral framework section, the part about the distinction between compliance response and trust-based response." She paused. "I've been doing this for 11 years, and I couldn't have written what you wrote there, but I recognized it when I read it. I've seen the difference. I didn't have language for it." "That's the point of the framework," Elena said, "to give you language for what you're already observing." Baskin looked at her for another moment. 2 hours? 2 hours. The working session happened in the main training yard with 6 handlers and their dogs, running through specific exercise sequences that Elena narrated and adjusted in real time. Not demonstrating the commands herself, not performing anything, but explaining the behavioral signals she was asking the handlers to watch for and guiding them through the specific micro-adjustments in approach and timing that produced trust-based compliance rather than fear-based compliance. The difference was small enough to miss and large enough to matter, and she had learned in those 18 months of clinical trial work that the most reliable way to teach it was not lecture, but iteration. Run the sequence, watch what the dog does, identify where the trust signal is present or absent, adjust, run it again. By the end of the first hour, 2 of the 6 handlers were producing clearly different results than they had at the start. By the end of the second hour, 4 were. The remaining 2 would need more time, which was not failure. It was the expected distribution of a skill that required recalibrating habits that had been built over years. She worked with Titan last. Not a command sequence, just time in the run, with Titan off his lead in the enclosed space, moving through the environment at his own pace while she sat on the floor near the gate and did nothing in particular. The 2 handlers assigned to Titan observed from outside the enclosure with the watchful attention of people who were trying to learn something specific. Titan was calmer than 4 days ago. Not fully settled, he would not be fully settled for weeks yet, and perhaps not to the level that pre-trauma function required, though Elena thought that was achievable if the modified protocol held and the environment remained consistent. But present, oriented, choosing, with the specific agency of a working dog that was recovering rather than deteriorating, to move around the space with his head up rather than pressed to the fence line. At one point, he walked to where Elena was sitting and pushed his head against her shoulder, which was not a trained behavior, and was not something she had invited, and was exactly the kind of thing that happened when an animal decided, on its own terms and for its own reasons, that a particular human had been sorted into the category of safe. She put her hand on the back of his neck and held it there for a moment. One of the observing handlers made a sound. She could not hear exactly what it was, but she understood the impulse. She spent a few minutes afterward talking with the two handlers about what they had observed and what the implications were for Titan's daily handling protocol. She answered their questions directly and did not oversimplify and did not pretend that recovery was a clean process with a predictable timeline, because it was not. It was messy and nonlinear and occasionally looked like regression when it was actually just the normal unevenness of something trying to rebuild from the ground up. "What if he has a bad day?" the younger of the two handlers asked. "He will have bad days. The question isn't whether he has them. It's what you do when he does." She looked at him. "The protocol gives you a decision tree. You use it. You document what happened and what you did and what the response was, and over time the data tells you what his individual pattern looks like, and that pattern is what guides you. And if the pattern looks like he's not improving, then you bring the data to me and we figure out what's missing." She said it simply, without the qualification that would have been appropriate if she had been uncertain about her own continued involvement. She was not uncertain about that anymore. 3 weeks after the hearing, the formal findings were released. Elena read them in her apartment on a Tuesday morning, with coffee that was actually hot because she had nowhere to be at 6 a.m. for the first time in recent memory. The document was 42 pages of densely reasoned institutional language, but the findings themselves were clear enough that no translation was required. The rejection of the behavioral recovery methodology submission had been improperly influenced by financial relationships between members of the Program Oversight Board and vendors in the training pipeline supply chain. The documentation of that influence was explicit and constituted a formal finding of corrupt interference in the program's administrative process. 3 individuals were named: Brennick and 2 others from the board whose names Elena recognized from the email chain she had kept for 7 years. The general was named in a separate section under the specific finding related to the authorization document for the methodology removal, which his cooperation had allowed the inquiry to fully contextualize. Criminal referrals had been made for all 4. The referrals were now in the hands of the appropriate offices. The final section of the findings addressed the methodology itself. It was 4 pages. It reviewed the original submission's evidence base, the trial data from the 18-month period, the outcomes documentation. It reviewed Elena's evaluation report from Raven Ridge and the field demonstration evidence from the intervention in the training yard. It reviewed the subsequent observations from the modified handling protocol and the preliminary outcome data from Titan's recovery trajectory. It concluded, in language that Castine had apparently written personally, that the behavioral recovery methodology, as documented in the original submission, was supported by sufficient evidence to warrant full integration into the program curriculum, subject to a formal review process that should be conducted within 90 days. The methodology was restored to the official record, not quietly, not buried in an appendix. In the main body of the formal findings of a major inquiry that was now a matter of public institutional record. Elena sat at her kitchen table and read that section 3 times and felt something she had no precise word for. Not relief, exactly, because relief implied a tension that had ended, and this was not quite that. It was more like a weight she had carried for so long that she had stopped registering its specific shape, and its absence did not feel light so much as it felt like the actual shape of things, without an addition she should never have been required to carry. She called Lund. He answered on the second ring, which meant he had been awake, which she had expected. "I read it," he said. "Me too." A silence that was not uncomfortable. The kind of silence between 2 people who had shared something significant and did not need to perform feelings about it to make them real. "What are you going to do?" he said. It was not quite a question. "They want me to lead this curriculum integration process," she said. "Castine's office reached out yesterday. 90-day review panel, methodology documentation, training protocol development for the integration rollout." She paused. "It would require a formal appointment to the program board, civilian consultant status. Are you going to take it?" She looked out the kitchen window. The autumn morning was doing what autumn mornings in Kellerton did, which was provide clear, flat light that made everything look exactly like itself without flattery or softening. "Yes," she said, "but I need something from you first." "What?" "The original trial data. The complete set, not just the submission documentation, the raw data from the 18-month period. All four of us collected it, but I was the only one who kept copies of the full set. I need to know if yours is still accessible." A pause. "It's accessible." "Then I need it. The integration panel should be working from the complete evidence base, not just what survived in my files." She paused. "And I need you to be part of the panel." A longer pause. "Elena, not as a witness, not as a source, as a researcher. The methodology is half yours. The curriculum integration process should include the people who built it." She waited. "What's your actual answer, Prescott?" She heard him exhale. "I'll need to notify my current employer." "You have time. The panel doesn't convene for 6 weeks." 6 weeks. Another exhale, this one with something different in it. Not reluctant, something more like a man measuring the distance between where he was and where he was being offered the option of going. "All right." She ended the call and sat for a moment, then picked up the phone again and called Krebs. The specialist answered quickly, the way she always did, with the reflexive readiness of someone who had spent the past 3 weeks operating at a sustained level of alertness. "The findings are out," Elena said. "I know. I read them this morning. Titan's preliminary outcome data is in there. Your documentation of the modified protocol observations is specifically cited." She paused. "You wrote good notes, Krebs." A brief silence. Then, with a quality that was not quite the forced brightness from the first day, but something more real and less effortful. "I had a good example." "How's the unit?" "Better than a week ago. Not where it needs to be." Krebs paused. "Baskin has been running the modified approach with all the handlers. Some of them are getting it faster than others. The dogs know the difference. You can see it in how they come into the morning exercises. Less of that coiled thing." She stopped. "I don't know how to describe it better than that." The coiled thing is the right description. Elena had used clinical language for it in the evaluation report, but Krebs's version was accurate in a way clinical language sometimes wasn't. "Keep documenting it. The curriculum integration panel is going to want field observation data from facilities already running the modified approach." Are you coming back to Raven Ridge?" "Not as a contractor. Differently." She did not explain further. There would be time for that. "Keep writing good notes." The public dimension of the inquiry findings landed in the way that Hargrove had warned it would, loudly, and with the specific kind of press attention that military contracting fraud generated when it involved a general's name and $51 million in documented irregular transactions. Elena read the coverage the same way she had read the earlier coverage, looking for what was accurate, what was incomplete, and what had been shaped by editorial choices she had no control over. Her name appeared in most of the significant coverage, which was different from the earlier round. Not as a central figure. The central figure in most coverage was the investigation itself, or the general, or the scale of the financial findings. But in the pieces that tried to explain how the investigation had developed, in the context that framed the methodology suppression as the origin point of a chain of institutional failure, her name was there. The lead author of the suppressed submission. The contractor whose field evaluation had resurfaced evidence that had been buried for 7 years. The person who had stood in a training yard with 18 war dogs and done something that nobody present had been able to explain in conventional terms. Several of the pieces got things wrong. One of them spelled her name incorrectly for 3 paragraphs. Another quoted her evaluation report in a way that stripped the clinical precision from it and made it sound more dramatic than she had written it, which was a particular kind of frustration that she filed away and did not act on because there was nothing useful she could do with it. One piece got it right. A long-form piece in a defense reporting journal, written by someone who had apparently read the full 42 pages of the formal findings and understood what they were reading. It spent 4 paragraphs on the methodology itself, what it was, what the evidence showed, why its suppression had produced the pattern of outcomes visible at Raven Ridge, and as the inquiry had noted in passing, at 2 other facilities using the same vendor-supplied training philosophy. It described Elena's career arc with accuracy, and without dramatization: combat medic, K-9 behavioral specialist, active service exit, civilian nursing career, contractor work. 7 years of trying to get the suppressed submission addressed through proper channels. One morning in a training yard. She read that piece twice. She did not share it with anyone. She set her phone down and went for a walk in the clear autumn air of Kellerton, the kind of walk that had no destination, that was about moving rather than arriving. And she thought about the piece's final paragraph, which had quoted the formal findings conclusion about the methodology and then added one sentence of its own. The question of what the program lost during 7 years of operating without this framework is one the formal findings do not attempt to answer. That was accurate. It was also the only part of the coverage that acknowledged what she had thought about on the drive home from Raven Ridge on the first evening, after the intervention and before the phone calls started and the timeline of the investigation began to accelerate. What it cost. Not her personally, though there was that. 7 years of carrying something without institutional support was a weight that left marks in ways that were real even when they were invisible. But the program. The dogs. The handlers who had been running inadequate methods, not because they were bad at their jobs, but because the framework that would have made them better had been taken out of the curriculum for reasons that had nothing to do with evidence. That was not a thing that got undone by a formal finding. It was a thing that got addressed imperfectly and over time by the work that came next. The Curriculum Integration Panel convened 6 weeks later in the program's central administrative facility in a city called Fordon, 2 hours from Kellerton. Elena drove. She arrived 7 minutes early, which was 3 minutes later than she had intended because the parking structure had a broken barrier arm that added 4 minutes to the entry process, which was the kind of thing that happened in real life and was not worth being irritated about. Lund was already in the conference room when she arrived. He was thinner than she remembered him from the years before everything, and his hair had gone mostly gray, and he stood up when she came in with the careful movement of someone whose body had acquired a few limitations since their mid-30s. She had not seen him in person in 7 years. They looked at each other across the conference room. "You're late," he said. "Broken barrier arm in the parking structure." "I was here 40 minutes early." He said it with the particular dry delivery that she had forgotten was one of his modes. "I was nervous." "I know." She set her bag down. "So was I." She was not sure that was entirely true, but it was true enough, and he seemed to understand what she meant by it, which was less about the panel itself and more about the specific difficulty of returning to a thing you had been separated from by a long and painful process and trying to find your relationship with it again on the other side. The panel had 9 members total. Castine had a seat. Hargrove was present as an observer, not a voting member. 3 active duty handlers with significant working dog experience. A veterinary officer with behavioral specialization, a curriculum development specialist from the program's training division, and Lund and Elena with the complete 18 months of raw trial data loaded into the shared document system, ready to be worked with for the first time by a panel that had the authority to do something with it. The first session lasted 6 hours. Elena ran it the way she had been running things for 30 years, which was without performance and without pretense, and with the specific relentlessness that came from understanding that the thing you were doing mattered and therefore deserved to be done properly, regardless of how long it took. It was difficult in the specific ways that good work was difficult. The data needed to be re-examined with current eyes. Some of the original methodology's parameters needed updating based on the 7 years of additional research that had happened elsewhere in the field during the period the program had not been using it, and there were legitimate disagreements among panel members about implementation specifics that required working through rather than around. Lund was good in the room. She had forgotten how good he was. The particular quality of someone who could hold a complex evidence set in working memory and move between its elements without losing the thread, who asked questions that were genuinely clarifying rather than performatively skeptical. They disagreed twice in the first session, specifically and substantively, and worked through both disagreements to positions that were better than either of them had started with. That was how it was supposed to work. During the break between the morning and afternoon sessions, she stood outside the building in the cold air with a cup of coffee that was too hot to drink yet, and she thought about the first morning at Raven Ridge, the cold-gone coffee from her car, the parking lot too far from the kennel block, Krebs's too bright briefing, Voss's arms folded across his chest, The particular quality of something unfinished that she had recognized in the facility, the way you recognized a sound you had heard before, even when you could not immediately name it. She thought about standing in the middle of that yard. Not the intervention itself, the moment before it, the 3 steps inside the gate, the decision to stop moving and simply be still. The way that stillness, genuine stillness, rather than performed calm, had been the actual mechanism, not the command, not the training history, not any specific expertise, though all of those things were present and mattered. The willingness to stop trying to control the situation and instead be a stable point in the middle of it, that was the thing that had worked. That was always the thing that worked, when it worked, and it was the hardest thing to teach because it could not be taught through instruction. It could only be demonstrated. She was going to spend the next however many years demonstrating it. She drank her coffee. It had cooled to the right temperature. The formal recognition ceremony, which Castine had insisted on over Elena's specific and repeated objections that a ceremony was unnecessary, happened on a cold morning in December in the program's central facility. It was not large, 20 people, maybe 25. The inquiry principals and the panel members and several facility commanders whose units would be early integration sites for the curriculum rollout. Hargrove was there. Lund was there, seated 2 chairs from Elena, with the slightly formal posture of someone attending an event they had not attended many of in recent years. Castine spoke briefly. She was good at brief, which Elena appreciated. She described the inquiry's findings and the curriculum integration process in terms that were accurate and non-theatrical. And then she said one additional thing that Elena had not expected, which was that the formal findings had included a specific recommendation that the program's official records be amended to reflect the original submission date and authorship of the behavioral recovery methodology, that the suppression be formally reversed, not just in the sense that the methodology was now reinstated, but in the sense that the record would show who had built it and when, with no gap, as though the removal had never occurred. It was a small thing, administratively. It was also not a small thing. Castine placed a formal appointment document on the table in front of Elena. The civilian consultant appointment to the program board, curriculum integration lead, effective immediately. She placed a second document beside it. The amended official record, with Elena's name restored as lead author of the original submission, dated 7 years ago, as though the document had simply been there all along. Elena looked at both documents. She looked at them for longer than was probably comfortable for the room, though no one said anything, and she understood that she was doing something unusual, which was allowing herself to actually feel the weight of what she was looking at rather than processing it and moving forward. She had spent 7 years moving forward without allowing that particular pause, and she decided, in that cold December room with 20-some people watching quietly, that she had earned the pause. She picked up the pen and signed the appointment document. Lund, 2 chairs down, was looking at the table. His jaw was set in the specific way of a man holding something together that he was not going to hold together perfectly, and had accepted that. She looked at him. He looked back. He nodded once, which was all that was required. After the ceremony, if 2 signatures and a brief formal statement constituted a ceremony, which Elena remained unconvinced about, she drove back to Raven Ridge. Not for an official reason. She had told Krebs she was coming, and Krebs had told Baskin, and Baskin had apparently told the handlers, because when Elena arrived at the kennel block, there were 6 handlers in the yard running the modified protocol observation exercises that she had started 3 weeks ago, with the specific attentiveness of people who expected to be observed and had decided that observation was something they wanted rather than something they were performing for. She watched for 20 minutes from the fence before going in. The difference from the first morning was visible in the way that real differences were visible when you knew what you were looking for. Not dramatic, not transformed, not the kind of change that announced itself. The dog's shoulders were lower in the command sequences. The handler's timing was better, and their timing was better, because they were watching for the specific signals the modified approach had taught them to watch for, rather than watching for compliance as a binary outcome. The work was slower and more attentive and more real. Titan was in the second exercise group. He ran the sequence with his assigned handler, the younger of the 2 she had talked with on the first return visit, whose name was Ortega, who had been the one to notice the empty kennel at 2 in the morning on the worst night of this whole sequence of events. Ortega was not a natural at the modified approach in the way that some handlers were. He had to think about it more deliberately, had to catch himself reverting to the prior method and consciously redirect. But he was doing it consistently, and Titan's response to the sequence was clear and clean and showed none of the coiled quality that Krebs had correctly named 3 weeks ago. When the exercise ended, Titan looked toward the fence where Elena was standing. He did not do anything dramatic. He was a working dog, not a story point. He looked at her with the direct, measuring attention of an animal that had filed her accurately in whatever internal taxonomy it maintained, and then he looked back at his handler and waited for the next directive with his ears forward and his body settled. Elena looked at him for a moment longer than was necessary. There were things she had learned in the months since that first morning at Raven Ridge that she would have said she already knew, because she had known versions of them for years. But knowing a thing in the abstract and knowing it through a specific experience that cost something real were different kinds of knowing, and she had the latter now in ways she had not had before. She knew that the people who had buried her work had done it not from malice, primarily, but from the specific cowardice of people who understood that what was right was also inconvenient and had chosen convenience with enough layers of rationalization that they could still regard themselves as reasonable. That was not a more forgivable thing than malice, but it was a more common one, and understanding it clearly was more useful than hating it. She knew that the 7 years had not been wasted exactly, though she had spent portions of them feeling that they were. The documentation she had maintained, the nursing practice she had built, which was its own thing of value independent of everything else, the specific knowledge of how institutional suppression actually worked, which she now had in exhaustive detail, which the integration process was going to need someone to hold because it would try to happen again in smaller and less dramatic forms, because it always tried. She knew that Titan's recovery was not her accomplishment in the way that accomplishments usually got assigned. She had provided a framework, an intervention, a stable point. The recovery was the dog's, the work was the dog's. The willingness to try again after a system had failed him was the dog's, and she was not going to take credit for that even in the privacy of her own thinking. She knew that the quiet thing, the standing still, the being present, the doing the work without waiting for someone to hand her the authority to do it, was not a tactic. It was not a strategy for managing powerful people or navigating difficult institutions. It was just who she was, built from years and experience and the kind of practice that comes from doing difficult things repeatedly until the difficulty becomes workable rather than absent. She had never been the person who announced herself. She had never needed to be. The yard had known her anyway. She pushed off the fence and walked toward the gate, and Krebs fell into step beside her from somewhere to the left. And Baskin was coming from the operations building, and the handlers were moving through the next exercise rotation, and Titan was running his sequence with Ortega, clean and present and considerably more whole than 3 months ago, and the yard was doing what a working facility did when it was working. The ordinary, imperfect, daily practice of people and animals learning to trust each other enough to do something hard together. It was not a perfect outcome. It was better than that. It was a real one, earned through a process that had been ugly and costly and had not spared anyone involved from the specific discomfort of being accountable to what they knew was true. The formal findings would be revised and challenged and probably imperfectly implemented. The criminal proceedings would be long and legally complicated and would produce outcomes that satisfied almost no one entirely. The curriculum integration would hit resistance at certain facilities and require more time than the optimistic projections suggested. Lund would have difficult days readjusting to institutional work. She would have difficult days carrying the weight of leading a process she had spent 7 years being excluded from. None of that was going to stop her. She had never needed the situation to be clean. She had needed it to be real. And it was finally, irreversibly, on the record and in the yard and in the specific calm of a dog who had been written off as a problem and had been given a second chance to show what he actually was. It was real. Elena Marlowe walked through the gate and into the training yard, and nobody laughed, and nobody asked her what she was doing there, and nobody told her she didn't belong. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had always